Section 1. The Family We All Know. There is a house on Spooner Street. You have probably walked past it 1,000 times in your mind without even realizing it. It sits on a quiet residential road in a fictional Rhode Island town. A two-story colonial with a green front door and a yard that has seen more chaos than most disaster films. Inside lives a family. They are imperfect in ways that range from mildly embarrassing to genuinely alarming. They fight over the television, argue about money, eat meals together, and sometimes ignore each other completely. And through every episode of every season across more than 2 decades of television, they keep coming back to the same table, the same living room couch, the same kitchen where Lois is cooking and Peter is doing something that should not be legal. The Griffin family from Family Guy has been part of the cultural furniture of American entertainment since the 31st of January 1999. That was the night the show first aired on Fox, right after the Super Bowl, which is one of the most coveted broadcast slots in all of television. Around 22 million people saw the first episode. The numbers dropped after that, as they do with most shows, but something about the Griffins had already taken root. People recognized something in that house on Spooner Street, even when what they were watching was completely absurd. Now, the official description of Family Guy is that it is a satirical animated comedy about a dysfunctional family. And that is technically accurate. But there is another reading of the show, one that takes a little longer to arrive at, and it goes something like this. Family Guy is one of the most sustained, detailed, and often accidentally honest portraits of broken parenting that primetime television has ever produced. The show did not set out to be a document of family dysfunction. It set out to be funny, and it succeeded at that, particularly in its earlier years. But in the course of doing all that funny business, it also created something that you can sit with on a quiet night and watch with new eyes. And what you see is a family that is failing its children in ways that are recognizable, painful, and occasionally profound. That is what this is about. Not a rant, not a takedown. More like a long, slow walk through that house on Spooner Street, room by room, character by character, looking at what the show put on screen about parents and children and the complicated space between them. Some of it is dark, some of it is surprisingly moving. A lot of it is things the writers may not have fully intended to say, but they said it anyway, and it has been sitting there on screen for over 25 years waiting to be looked at. So settle in. Get comfortable. Let the voice wash over you. We are going to go through this gently, and we are going to be here for a while. Before any of the analysis begins, before we go season by season and character by character, it is worth spending some time understanding why the Griffins matter in the first place. Why this family, rather than the many other animated families that have populated adult television? What is it about Peter and Lois and their 3 kids and their talking dog that turned Family Guy into such a cultural institution? Part of the answer is timing. Family Guy arrived in 1999, at a moment when The Simpsons had already been on the air for a decade and had established a template for what an animated adult comedy family could look like. Seth MacFarlane, who created Family Guy at the remarkably young age of 25, was clearly influenced by The Simpsons. The working-class patriarch, the patient wife, the kids in various stages of adolescence and childhood, the neighborhood full of recurring characters. These were familiar elements, but MacFarlane was also bringing something specific to the table. His humor was wilder, more free associative, and more willing to lean into pure absurdism. The cutaway gag format, which the show became famous and later somewhat notorious for, allowed the storytelling to fly in directions that felt genuinely unpredictable. You never quite knew where the next joke was going to come from. But the other part of the answer is the family dynamics themselves. What made people care about the Griffins was not just the cutaways or the pop culture references or the willingness to push into controversial territory. It was the fact that underneath all the noise and chaos, the show was telling stories about a family. A real, messy, loving, failing family. Peter making a terrible decision and Lois having to manage the fallout. Meg wanting to be seen by parents who kept looking past her. Chris drifting through his teenage years with nobody giving him the attention he needed. Stewie sitting in his high chair, planning elaborate schemes that nobody around him would ever understand. These were not just comedy setups, they were, at their best, something close to real. The show premiered at a time when a particular kind of father was everywhere on television. The bumbling, well-meaning dad who messed things up but always came through in the end. Tim Allen in Home Improvement, Ray Romano in Everybody Loves Raymond. Even Homer Simpson, for all his selfishness and stupidity, operated within a framework where his love for his family was never really in question. Peter Griffin in those early seasons fit this mold. He was incompetent in ways that were funny rather than frightening. He drank too much and thought too little, and got his family into situations that no sensible person would have allowed. But he hugged his wife. He told her he loved her. He occasionally said something to one of his children that suggested he was paying attention, that he knew them, that he cared, and that mattered. It mattered because it gave the show an emotional floor. You could laugh at Peter getting himself into ridiculous situations because you knew, somewhere underneath it all, that he would come around. The family had warmth. It was eccentric warmth, delivered through a cartoon with cutaway gags about random celebrities and historical figures, but it was warmth nonetheless. What happened over the course of the show's long run, and this is the story that this whole piece is about, is that the warmth gradually, then rapidly, then dramatically changed. The characters evolved in ways that reflected the pressures of long-running television, shifting writing staffs, network relationships, and creative decisions that sometimes served the show well and sometimes did not. The parenting dynamic at the center of the Griffin family, which had started out as a comedic but recognizable version of real family life, transformed into something far stranger and more troubling. And yet, throughout all of that transformation, the show kept finding these moments. These pockets of real feeling that broke through the absurdity and reminded you that underneath the shock value and the cutaways and the flanderization, there were real character relationships being explored. They were not always explored well. They were often explored in ways that got reversed the following week when the episode reset. But they were there, and they said things about parents and children that were worth paying attention to. The Griffin family is a prism. Hold it up to the light and you see different things depending on the angle. Hold it up to the light of comedy, and you see a brilliantly constructed series of jokes about a lovably ridiculous dad and his long-suffering family. Hold it up to the light of psychology, and you see a portrait of a household where dysfunction has become so normalized that nobody inside it even notices anymore. Hold it up to the light of parenting theory, and you see almost every failure mode that family therapists and child development specialists talk about, rendered in cartoon form and presented as entertainment. This script is going to hold it up to all three lights, slowly and carefully, and let you see what is there. We are going to move through it at a relaxed pace. There is no rush. There is something almost meditative about going through a show you have probably watched dozens of times and looking at it with fresh eyes, noticing things that were always in the frame but that the comedy kept you from fully processing. The house on Spooner Street has a lot to show us. Let us start with the man standing at the front door. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where this community reaches, and if you have not subscribed yet, now would be a great time. It helps more than you know, and it keeps this kind of long-form content coming. Section 2. Peter Griffin. The blueprint of a TV dad. Broken. There is a specific kind of man that the American television sitcom spent most of the 20th century perfecting. He was usually overweight or at least somewhat soft around the middle. He worked a job that required labor rather than thought. He had opinions that were frequently wrong and expressed them anyway. He loved sports and beer, and somewhere beneath all the fumbling and noise, he loved his family with a kind of inarticulate devotion that only showed itself in certain moments, usually near the end of an episode when the lesson had been learned. This archetype goes back to Ralph Kramden in The Honeymooners, runs through Archie Bunker in All in the Family, and arrives at Al Bundy in Married with Children and Homer Simpson in The Simpsons. Each iteration tweaked the formula slightly. Each one pushed the character further in some directions while pulling back in others. By 1999, the template was familiar enough that Seth MacFarlane could build on it while adding his own particular brand of absurdist chaos. Peter Griffin was designed to be the culmination of all of that, an affectionate tribute to and riff on the lovable, incompetent father figure. And in his earliest form, he was exactly that. He was a man who drank beer at a bar called the Drunken Clam with his friends Joe and Quagmire in Cleveland. He worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, then later at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. He was not smart. He was not careful. He did not always listen when Lois was speaking to him, but there was a fundamental decency to him, a sense that when it counted, he would show up for his family, even if showing up for his family looked like tripping over everything in his path along the way. The first episode of the show is called Death Has a Shadow, and it sets up Peter's relationship with parenting in a way that tells you everything about what the show originally intended for this character. Peter gets fired from his job at the toy factory for falling asleep during a safety inspection. Rather than tell Lois, he applies for welfare. Through a clerical error, he starts receiving welfare checks for enormous amounts of money, far beyond what any real welfare payment would cover. He uses the money irresponsibly, buying extravagant things, and eventually the scheme unravels when the money literally rains down on a football stadium during a Patriots game. Peter ends up in court, is sentenced to community service, and the episode ends with the family back to normal. What is interesting about this episode from a parenting perspective is not the plot, it is the texture. Peter applies for welfare because he is embarrassed to tell Lois the truth, which tells you something about his relationship with shame and honesty. He then misuses the money in increasingly self-indulgent ways, which tells you something about his relationship with impulse control. But when he is caught and the consequences arrive, he does not run. He faces them. The family weathers the storm together. There is a scene near the end where Peter and Lois are together after everything has settled, and the warmth between them is genuine. He knows he messed up. She knows he messed up. They are still here, still together. This is the early Peter. He is a man who creates problems and then, imperfectly and usually too late, tries to solve them. He is embarrassing. He is occasionally mortifying. But he is present. He is trying. The love underneath the bumbling is visible. In the second episode of the series, I Never Met the Dead Man, Peter accidentally knocks out the town's cable television by crashing into a telephone pole while distracted. The episode then becomes about the Griffin family's attempts to cope without television. Meg, who is around 17 years old in this episode, is attempting to get her driver's license, and Peter, in a moment of genuine parental engagement, offers to teach her. He is a disaster at it, naturally, and almost gets them both killed multiple times, but he is there. He is in the car with his daughter, trying to do a dad thing, and even when it goes wrong, the intention behind it is clear. The third episode, Chitty Chitty Death Bang, is one of the most revealing early episodes for what it shows about how the show originally conceived parenting within the Griffin household. Stewie, who in these early seasons is fully committed to his evil genius persona, is planning to meet his agent, which turns out to be a cult leader who believes Stewie is a demon sent to end the world. The main plot follows Peter and Lois desperately trying to keep Stewie's birthday party from being ruined after Peter loses the reservation at Cheesy Charlie's, a children's entertainment venue that is basically the show's version of Chuck E. Cheese. What this episode does, underneath its comedy, is establish that Peter and Lois genuinely want Stewie to have a good birthday. They are not neglecting him. They are not indifferent to him. They are scrambling to make his first birthday special because that is what parents do, and in these early seasons, the Griffins were parents who cared about those things. The fact that Stewie is meanwhile plotting with a demonic cult is the show's absurdist overlay, but the parenting behavior beneath it is completely grounded. Throughout the first 3 seasons of the show, this pattern holds. Peter is foolish. He makes terrible decisions. He embarrasses his family in public. He drinks too much and thinks too little, and says things that should not be said. But he also has these moments of genuine parental warmth that are scattered through the episodes like signposts, reminding you who he actually is. In The Sun Also Draws, the 4th episode of the first season, Peter discovers that Chris has a talent for art, and he finds a way to support it despite his initial skepticism. It is clumsy support, delivered through a series of misadventures, but it is support. He sees his son. He acknowledges who his son actually is. That is not nothing. In A Picture's Worth $1,000, a second season episode, Chris is discovered to have genuine artistic talent after an art dealer spots one of his pieces. The family travels to New York, where Chris becomes something of a prodigy. The interesting thing about Peter in this episode is that he gets jealous of Chris's success, which is a very human reaction even if it is not a good one. He feels left behind when his son becomes the center of attention. But the episode navigates this and arrives at a place where Peter can acknowledge Chris's talent and take pride in it. The jealousy is resolved. The love underneath it was always there. Season 2 includes an episode called Lethal Weapons, where Lois becomes a star student in a karate class and starts to let the power go to her head. What is interesting here from a parenting angle is how Peter and the kids respond to Lois's transformation. Peter is confused and threatened. Meg and Chris are both in the background, watching their parents navigate a conflict that the kids have no power over. This is actually a very common dynamic in real families with small children or teenagers. The parents' relationship with each other shapes the emotional atmosphere of the entire household, and the kids just live inside it, absorbing whatever energy the adults are creating. The show does not dwell on this, because it is a comedy and the karate jokes are the point, but the structure of the family dynamic is accurately observed even when it is being played for laughs. Season 3 of Family Guy is generally considered part of the golden era of the show, and it contains some of the most emotionally grounded parenting moments in the series. The episode The Thin White Line begins a two-part story involving Brian being recruited as a drug-sniffing dog for the police and eventually developing a cocaine problem. This might seem like an odd choice to highlight as a parenting story, but watch how Peter and Lois respond to Brian's addiction. They do not immediately shame him or kick him out. They organize an intervention. They try to get him help. They are imperfect about it in the ways that all families are imperfect when dealing with addiction, but the basic parental instinct to show up for someone who is struggling is intact. In Road to Rhode Island, a Season 2 episode that is one of the most beloved in the show's history, Stewie ends up on a cross-country adventure with Brian after being left by mistake at Stewie's grandmother's house. The episode is remembered mostly for the comedy of Brian and Stewie's dynamic, but what it also shows is that Lois made a logistical error in childcare, and that both she and Peter were immediately distressed when they discovered Stewie was not where he was supposed to be. The parental concern is genuine. It comes out through Lois's frantic phone calls and Peter's attempts to be supportive in his characteristically clueless way. The family rallies when a child is potentially in danger. That is the early Griffin household. There is a scene in the Season 3 episode Peter Griffin, husband, father, brother, that encapsulates what the early show understood about Peter Griffin as a father. Peter discovers that one of his ancestors was a black man named Nate Griffin, which prompts an episode exploring Peter's relationship with race and identity. Near the end, there is a moment where Peter is with his kids, and he is trying, in his inarticulate way, to explain something complicated to them. He does not explain it well. He gets confused and the explanation comes out wrong. But the impulse is there. The impulse to sit down with your children and talk about something important, to try to pass something meaningful down to them, even when you are not equipped for the conversation. That impulse was a core part of who Peter Griffin was in the show's early years. These first 3 seasons built a character who was deeply flawed as a father but who operated within a recognizable framework of love and responsibility. He was the kind of dad that you might roll your eyes at, the kind who shows up to your school play and falls asleep, the kind who gives advice that is completely wrong but means it sincerely. He was not a great father, but he was a real one. The relationship between Peter and Lois in these early years also deserves attention because it forms the foundation of the entire family's emotional life. They argued. They had different ideas about things and did not always agree on how to handle situations involving the kids. But their marriage had warmth in it. Physical affection. Humor that was shared between two people who knew each other very well. When Peter did something that genuinely hurt Lois, the episode found its way to a moment where he acknowledged it and tried to repair the damage. The repair was not always graceful. It was often accompanied by a gag or a cutaway or a physical comedy bit. But it happened. This matters because parents' relationships with each other are the single most powerful model that children have for how relationships work. Kids watch their parents interact and absorb a template. They see how conflict is handled, how affection is expressed, what it looks like when two adults love each other imperfectly but genuinely. In those early seasons, the model that Peter and Lois provided for Meg, Chris, and Stewie was flawed in certain ways but fundamentally okay. It was a marriage between two people who had chosen each other and who kept choosing each other even when things were hard. That is where the story starts. A man with beer and bad ideas and a genuine heart. A wife who was patient in ways that real people find difficult to sustain. 3 kids who were growing up in the shelter of all that chaos, imperfectly loved but loved. Then the show ran for a long time. Writers came and went. Creative decisions were made. And slowly, then suddenly, the man at the center of that family changed in ways that left a mark on every child in that house. Section 3. How Peter Became a Monster. The Flanderization Spiral. The word Flanderization comes from Ned Flanders, the neighbor from The Simpsons. Ned started out as a many-sided character who happened to be very religious. Over the many seasons of that show, the writers stripped away more and more of who Ned was until his entire personality collapsed into a single trait: devout Christianity, rendered in an increasingly exaggerated form. He went from being a person to being a walking religious joke. That process of reducing a complex character to a single amplified trait is what Flanderization means, and it is one of the most well-documented problems in long-running television. Family Guy did not just suffer from Flanderization. Family Guy might be the most extreme example of it in the history of animated television, and no character exemplifies this more completely than Peter Griffin. The transformation happened gradually between seasons 4 and 8, and then continued to deepen and accelerate from season 8 onward. Understanding the arc requires going through it carefully, season by season, because each season added another layer, pushed another boundary, and moved Peter another step further from the man who used to tell his daughter she was wonderful on a drive home from a night out. When the show returned from cancellation in 2005 for its 4th season, Peter was already showing signs of a shift. The intelligence, which had never been high, dropped a noticeable notch. In the first 3 seasons, Peter was dumb in a way that felt grounded in reality. He made the kinds of mistakes that people who are not very smart but who are trying their best actually make. He misread situations. He took things literally that were not meant literally. He chose the wrong solution to a problem because he did not think through the consequences carefully enough. This was relatable stupidity, the kind that has a long tradition in comedy going all the way back through television history. In season 4, the stupidity started shifting in a different direction. It became more extreme, more total. The gaps in Peter's reasoning grew larger. The things he did not understand moved from being the specific blind spots of an ordinary, undereducated man to being the kind of thing that would have made it functionally impossible for him to hold a job or maintain a household. There were moments in early season 4 where you looked at something Peter did or said and thought, this is not just dumb, this is something else. This is a person who exists in a category that is slightly outside the range of normal human experience. The comedy writers were finding that escalating Peter's stupidity got bigger laughs, which makes sense as a short-term creative decision. If the stupid thing he did last season got a laugh, doing a stupider thing this season should get a bigger one. The problem is that there is a ceiling on this approach, and the show hit that ceiling and then kept going. Because at some point, what you have is not a dumb man who means well. What you have is someone with what would clinically be considered profound cognitive impairment. And the comedy of that person being in charge of a family starts to take on a different texture. But the intelligence was not the real issue. Plenty of characters on television have been written as extremely low intelligence and remained sympathetic and even lovable. The real issue was what happened to Peter's moral character alongside his intelligence. In the first 3 seasons, Peter was dumb, but his moral compass was, if sometimes confused, basically pointing in the right direction. He felt bad when he hurt people he cared about. He could be shamed into better behavior by Lois, or by the consequences of his actions catching up with him. He had a functional conscience. It worked slowly and unreliably, but it worked. Starting in season 5 and becoming unmistakable by season 7, that compass started to drift. Peter began doing things that were not just stupid, but actively cruel. Things that a person with a normally functioning conscience would not do. He would harm someone, look at them being harmed, and respond with indifference or amusement rather than guilt. The internal check that had existed in the early seasons, the mechanism that eventually made him feel bad and try to make things right, started to malfunction. By season 8, the version of Peter Griffin that had started the show was almost unrecognizable. The character who had driven to the Scout headquarters to get Chris back in the Scouts, who had sat with Meg and told her she was wonderful, who had sung that Peter Frampton song for Lois on their anniversary, had been replaced by something fundamentally different. The new Peter was not dumb and loving. He was dumb and indifferent, dumb and cruel, dumb and dangerous. Specific episodes illustrate this clearly. The transcript provided at the beginning of this research touched on the episode Baby It's Cold Outside, where Peter pushes Lois underwater when he believes he sees a shark, then flees in the boat, leaving her behind. This one moment encapsulates the entire transformation. In the early seasons, Peter would have tried to protect Lois. He would have been ineffective and probably made things worse, but he would have been trying to save her. In the later seasons, his first instinct is self-preservation even at the cost of his wife's life, and the episode treats this as a punchline. The arc is almost Shakespearean in its structure. If Shakespeare had been writing a comedy about a cartoon father on a network animated show, you have a protagonist who starts with genuine virtues, however clouded by incompetence. You watch those virtues erode season by season under the pressure of a creative process that kept looking for bigger reactions. You arrive, eventually, at a character who has almost nothing in common with who he was at the start. What makes this particularly significant from a parenting perspective is the direction of the cruelty. The people Peter became cruel toward were not strangers or enemies. They were his family, his wife, his children. The people who depended on him most, who had the least power to protect themselves from him, who had nowhere else to go, became the primary targets of his worst behavior. The physical violence toward the children escalated notably during this period. In the early seasons, physical comedy involving children was handled the way it is in most animated shows: exaggerated, clearly impossible, consequence-free in the way that cartoon physics are consequence-free. Stewie could get hit by a bus and be fine 30 seconds later. Chris could fall down the stairs and be up and talking in the next scene. This is standard animation territory. It is not depicting realistic harm. It is doing what cartoons do. But the violence in the later seasons changed in texture and intent. It was no longer purely slapstick. There was an edge to it. Peter would do things to his children, particularly to Meg, that were not funny in the way that cartoon violence is funny. They were funny, if they were funny at all, because of the cruelty involved, because of the disregard, because of the performance of not caring that Peter brought to them. That is a different kind of humor. It is humor that is asking you to laugh at someone's suffering rather than at an absurd physical situation. The difference matters. The cycle of repair and reset is one of the most frustrating patterns in the show's treatment of Peter as a parent, because there were, scattered throughout the difficult middle seasons, episodes that acknowledged what Peter had become and tried to address it. Episodes where he learned something real about himself, where he had a moment of genuine self-awareness, where he and one of his children connected in a way that felt earned and true. And then the following episode, everything was exactly as it had been before. The lesson did not stick. The connection did not matter. This is actually a pattern that appears in real family dysfunction as well. The parent who is mostly destructive but who has occasional episodes of genuine warmth or connection. In psychology, this pattern is more dangerous than consistent neglect or even consistent abuse in some ways, because the unpredictability creates a specific kind of attachment style in the children. They keep coming back for the good moments. They are conditioned by the intermittent reinforcement to keep hoping, to keep expecting that this time the good version of the parent will show up and stay. The inconsistency itself becomes a trap. The show obviously was not consciously exploring this dynamic. It was not that thoughtful about what it was doing. But the pattern is there on screen, and it is remarkably close to what that kind of parental inconsistency actually looks like from a child's perspective. Peter's treatment of his friends underwent a parallel degradation that mirrors his parenting transformation. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer who became one of Peter's closest friends, started the show as someone Peter genuinely respected and even envied. Joe was capable and admired. Peter's jealousy of him was something that the show actually explored with some nuance in the early episodes. As the show went on, Joe became the target of increasingly mean-spirited jokes, with his disability shifting from being a character trait to being a punchline, and with Peter moving from being a friend who respected Joe to being one of the main people tearing him down. This mirrors what happened with Peter's relationship to his children. The people who had started as people he cared about became targets. The care became cruelty. The love became indifference. And the show asked you to laugh at it, and sometimes you did, because the writing still had enough craft to make the jokes land even when the underlying character behavior was increasingly uncomfortable to watch. By the time you get to the later seasons, say season 11 through 15, Peter Griffin is doing things on a regular basis that, if you tried to describe them to someone who had only watched the first 3 seasons, would seem like you were describing a completely different character. not an exaggerated version of the original, not a more extreme iteration of the same person. A different person entirely, wearing the same face and voice, living in the same house, but operating from a completely different set of values, impulses, and emotional responses. The tragedy of this, from a storytelling perspective, is that it was not inevitable. The show did not have to go this way. American Dad, which was created around the same time by many of the same people and which is explored at length in a later section, managed to keep its similarly structured father figure recognizable across the same period. Stan Smith got worse in some episodes and better in others, but his core remained intact. The people running Family Guy made choices that the people running American Dad did not make, and the results are visible on screen. Peter Griffin did not just become a bad father because the show went on too long. He became a bad father because writers, week by week and season by season, chose to push him further, kept choosing the darker laugh over the warmer one, kept opting for cruelty over clumsiness, and in doing so, they removed from the center of a show about a family, the thing that makes a family story worth watching. They removed the love. The love is still technically there, in the sense that Peter occasionally says he loves his family or does something that can be read as affectionate, but it no longer feels like the foundation of who he is. It feels like a residual artifact of the character who used to live in that body, surfacing briefly before being submerged again by the current version. And every child in that house was shaped by all of it. Every season of Peter's Flanderization landed somewhere in the lives of Meg, Chris, and Stewie. We are going to go through each of them. But first, the woman who was supposed to be the ballast. Section 4. Lois Griffin, the keeper who stopped keeping. The original conception of Lois Griffin was elegant in its simplicity. She was the sane one. In a household that contained an incompetent husband, a future supervillain baby, an awkward teenage boy, a talking philosophically inclined dog, and Meg, Lois was the person who kept the structure standing. She cooked the meals and drove the carpools and talked people down from ledges, both literal and metaphorical. She had a past that was more colorful than her present, hinting at a Lois who had lived before she became a wife and mother, but in the day-to-day of the show's early seasons, she was the anchor. This kind of character has a long tradition in television. The patient, competent wife and mother who manages a chaotic household while her husband generates most of the chaos. It is a role that has been criticized, sometimes fairly, for being too constrained, too defined by what she enables and contains rather than by who she actually is. But the early show gave Lois enough texture, enough humor, enough of her own storylines and personality quirks to make her feel like a person rather than a function. She was a Pewterschmidt before she was a Griffin, which meant she came from old money, from a wealthy and somewhat cold family that never fully approved of Peter. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, was a recurring source of material for the show, a patrician villain who tolerated Peter at best and despised him at other times. The fact that Lois had given up that world to marry Peter, to live on Spooner Street and raise their kids in a decidedly non-wealthy environment, said something about her. It suggested values. A rejection of a certain kind of status and a choice of something messier but more real. In the early seasons, Lois's parenting was characterized by something that the show handled with surprising accuracy. The particular exhaustion of being the responsible parent in a household where the other parent is largely not responsible. She was managing Peter's failings while also managing the kids' needs, and she did it without falling apart, which is exactly how a certain kind of functional parent operates. You hold everything together because you have decided that is your role, and you do it even when it costs you something. Lois took her role as the moral center of the Griffin family seriously in those first 3 seasons. When Peter did something that crossed a line, she called it out, not always successfully, not always in ways that led to real change, but she was a presence. She was watching. She knew what was happening in her household, and she was engaged with it. Her relationship with each of the kids had specific qualities. With Meg, she was supportive in a somewhat distracted way, the kind of mother who loved her daughter but who did not always have the bandwidth to really see her. This is a very common maternal pattern, particularly in families where the mother is managing a difficult marriage and a chaotic household. You care, but you are stretched thin, and your caring does not always penetrate in the ways it needs to. Lois in the early seasons genuinely cared about Meg, and there were episodes that made this visible. Episodes where she went out of her way to help Meg navigate something difficult at school or with a relationship. With Chris, Lois's relationship had a sweetness to it. She saw something in Chris that Peter often missed or dismissed, which was a genuine warmth and sensitivity underneath the surface clumsiness. Lois was the parent who was more likely to notice when Chris was hurt or struggling, and to ask about it. She was not always equipped to help in the ways Chris needed, but the noticing was there. Her relationship with Stewie in the early seasons is one of the most interesting parenting dynamics in the whole show, because it operates on two levels simultaneously. On the surface level, what Lois sees is a perfectly normal baby. Bright-eyed, healthy, developing on schedule. She holds him and nurses him and takes him to the park and responds to all his surface baby behaviors in the way that a competent and loving mother would respond. Underneath that surface, of course, is a fully formed consciousness, planning her destruction in considerable detail. The dramatic irony is the source of most of the early Stewie comedy. Lois is being a good mother to a child she does not understand, cannot understand, because understanding him would require knowing something that the show keeps from her. There is something poignant about this, actually. Lois loves Stewie in the only way available to her, which is by loving the version of him she can see. And the version she can see is adorable and normal. The version she cannot see, the version that the audience sees, is alien and dangerous and brilliant. The gap between those two versions is a metaphor for something that real parents experience in less extreme form. Your child has an inner life you cannot access. You are loving the parts that are visible to you. The parts that are not visible remain mysterious. In the first 3 seasons, Lois's own occasional moral failures were presented in a way that actually added complexity to her character rather than undermining her. She was not perfect. She had moments of vanity, of pettiness, of hypocrisy. She was sometimes unkind to Meg in ways that were not fully justified by the circumstances. She occasionally chose her own comfort or desires over her children's needs. These were real things, but they were presented as her flaws, things she was aware of and sometimes overcame and sometimes did not. They were part of a character who was fully human. After the show returned from cancellation and ran through its middle seasons, Lois's character underwent a transformation that was, in some ways, more subtle than Peter's, but equally significant in its impact on the show's parenting dynamics. The transformation of Lois from anchor to chaos participant changed the entire emotional structure of the Griffin household. The first major shift was in her tolerance for Peter's behavior. In the early seasons, Lois maintained a genuine position as the household's conscience. She called Peter out. She held the line. She was not always successful, but there was always a line to hold. As the show moved into its middle seasons, Lois's objections to Peter's behavior became increasingly performative. She would say the right things in the right moments, but without the follow-through that had characterized her earlier behavior. The calling out happened, but nothing changed, and the nothing changing started to feel like it was fine with her. The second shift was in her relationship with Meg, and this is where the parenting story gets genuinely dark. In the first 3 seasons, Lois was imperfect toward Meg, but essentially in her corner. As the seasons progressed and the writers began treating Meg as the show's designated punching bag, Lois's behavior toward her oldest daughter shifted from imperfect support to active participation in the abuse. Not always in the aggressive way that Peter's behavior shifted, more passively, more through absence and silence. She stopped defending Meg. She stopped intervening when Peter treated Meg badly. She started, in certain episodes, joining in the contempt. From a psychological perspective, this is the more devastating parenting failure of the two. When the parent who was supposed to be the safe one, the one who saw you and cared about you, stops being that person and starts either actively or passively contributing to your mistreatment, it is a particular kind of abandonment that is different from anything Peter's cluelessness or cruelty could produce. Meg needed Lois. In the early seasons, whatever Lois's limitations, Meg had her. In the later seasons, Meg did not. The show was aware of this on some level. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party in Season 10, which is discussed at length in its own section later in this script, includes a moment where Meg calls out Lois specifically, telling her that a mother is supposed to be the one person in the world who is always on your side, and Lois is not that person. Lois cries. She is moved by this. And then, because the show cannot commit to its own best moments, everything resets and Lois is back to her normalized behavior in subsequent episodes. One of the most revealing windows into Lois's complicated maternal instincts is the information the show provides about the circumstances of her children's births. Over the course of the series, details emerged that painted a picture of unplanned parenthood. Meg was born after Lois's birth control was neutralized by antibiotics, something that is actually possible in certain circumstances, though much less common than television suggests. Chris was the result of a broken condom, with the lawsuit from the condom manufacturer apparently financing the family's house on Spooner Street. Stewie's conception has been given multiple contradictory explanations across different episodes, as the show's non-continuity allows. The writers clearly did not intend these details to be analyzed as a coherent portrait of maternal ambivalence. They were individual jokes in individual episodes, but taken together, they create a picture of a woman who became a mother to all three of her children under circumstances that were not planned and not particularly welcomed. The show also includes moments where Lois explicitly states that she did not want children or that she resented the constraints of motherhood. These statements are usually played for laughs or shock, but they land differently depending on how you watch the show. They are part of a characterization that was richer and more complicated than it might appear on the surface. In the later seasons, a more deliberate attempt was made to explore Lois's inner life and her ambivalence about her role as a mother and wife. Her kleptomania storyline was actually one of the more thoughtful things the show did with her character, because it treated the stealing not as simple moral failing, but as a symptom of something real. A woman who felt trapped in a life she had not fully chosen, acting out in the only way available to her. This was interesting material for a character who had been flattened in so many ways during the difficult middle seasons. The academic who wrote a 2023 piece in the Massachusetts Daily Collegian calling Lois one of the greatest written characters on television had a point, even if it is a point that requires generous interpretation. Lois's arc across the show's entire run is genuinely more complex than it appears. She goes from being a conventional television mom through a period of significant degradation where she becomes part of the dysfunction rather than its corrective, into a more recent phase where the writers seem to have found some of what made her interesting in the first place. The journey is uneven and often poorly executed, but the journey is real. What the show's handling of Lois ultimately demonstrates is the specific danger of a parent who starts strong and then fails. There is a psychological argument that children who have had a secure attachment in early childhood are better positioned to handle subsequent difficulties than children who never had security at all. But there is also something particularly disorienting about losing the secure base you thought you had. For Meg, especially, the Lois who turned away from her in the middle seasons was not the absence of security she had never had. She was the withdrawal of security that had once been present, and that is its own kind of wound. Section 5. Meg Griffin. Growing up under the weight of everyone's cruelty. Meg Griffin is the most important character on Family Guy. This is not an obvious statement. It is not the one most people would make. But when you look at the show as a document of parenting and family dynamics, Meg is the character through whom all of the show's most honest and most troubling observations are expressed. She is the one who receives the consequences of everything. She is the seismograph of the household's dysfunction. Whatever is wrong in the Griffin family registers first and most deeply in Meg. She was voiced in the first season by Lacey Chabert, a casting choice that gave her a particular quality, slightly more assertive and confident than the character would later become. Starting with the second season, Mila Kunis took over the role and has voiced Meg ever since. Kunis's Meg has a slightly softer quality, a more genuine vulnerability that makes the cruelty directed at her land differently than it would have with a more strident performance. In those first 3 seasons, Meg was the normal one. This was the original joke. You had a baby who was a potential supervillain, a dog who drank martinis and wrote novels, a husband who was barely comprehensible, a wife holding everything together with visible strain, and then Meg, who was a teenage girl who wanted to fit in at school and occasionally argued with her parents about curfews. The humor came from how ordinary she was by comparison. In a family of cartoonish extremes, Meg was just a person. She was unpopular at James Woods Regional High School. She did not have a large friend group. She was not particularly good at anything notable enough to get recognition. She had interests and opinions that were ignored by the family most of the time. She wanted to be loved and acknowledged in the straightforward way that most adolescents do, and she mostly did not get it. and she was learning to manage that disappointment in real time. This is actually a profoundly relatable portrait of teenage girlhood. Not the extreme later version of Meg, but the early version. The girl who is not the exciting one, not the exceptional one, not the one anyone rushes to include. She is there, she is doing the work of growing up, and the adults around her are mostly too caught up in their own concerns to really see her. Any viewer who felt like the forgotten child in their family, who felt like they were always slightly outside the frame of the family's attention, would have recognized something in early Meg. The first instance of what would become the show's sustained campaign against Meg occurred in the very first episode. Peter grounds Meg for touching the thermostat. The punishment is disproportionate and delivered with a querulousness that signals how little Peter actually thinks about the effect of his behavior on her. Then, later in the same episode, when collagen lip injections deform Meg's face, Lois says she deserves it and declines to help fix it. These are small moments, easy to miss. But they establish the baseline from which the show would increasingly deviate in a darker direction. In the second episode, I Never Met the Dead Man, Peter tells Meg that her birth was a disappointment. This is a joke. It lands as a joke. But let us sit with it for a moment. A father tells his adolescent daughter that her birth was a disappointment. Even in the context of a cartoon, even in the context of an episode whose main focus is elsewhere, this is a remarkable thing to place in the first 4 episodes of a new show. The writers thought it was funny enough to include it in the series' earliest moments. What it is also doing, whether intentionally or not, is establishing a certain kind of father-daughter dynamic as the show's default setting. For the first 3 seasons, these moments were scattered and relatively mild. Meg was not beloved by her family, but she was not tormented by them. She was ignored more than she was actively targeted. The treatment she received at home was the kind that many teenagers receive. The kind that is unkind and sometimes hurtful, but that does not rise to the level of genuine abuse. The home was not a safe haven for Meg, but it was also not a battlefield. The transformation began in season 4 and accelerated significantly by seasons 5 and 6. The jokes about Meg shifted from being about her ordinariness to being about her appearance. Characters began making comments about her physical appearance with increasing hostility. The comedy moved from passive neglect to active contempt. This is a meaningful distinction. Neglect says, "You are not interesting enough to notice." Contempt says, "You are worth noticing for negative reasons. Your existence registers, but as a source of displeasure." By seasons 7 through 10, the treatment of Meg by her family had become one of the defining features of the show. Peter was farting on her as a form of entertainment. He was physically shoving her out of the frame of family activities. He was forgetting she existed for episodes at a time and expressing relief when reminded she was gone. He was making comments about wishing she did not exist, about having tried to abandon her as a baby, about her appearance and language that ranged from insensitive to genuinely vicious. Lois had stopped defending her. Chris had started participating in the mockery. Stewie, who had barely interacted with Meg in the early seasons, was now throwing casual cruelty her direction alongside everyone else. And the broader world of the show had joined in as well. At school, the bullying was intense and sustained. Strangers on the street commented negatively on her. The town as a whole seemed to have reached a consensus that Meg Griffin was someone toward whom contempt was the appropriate response. The real-world psychology of what the show was depicting here, even unintentionally, is significant. What happens to a child who grows up in an environment where the primary parental response to their existence is contempt? Where the adults in the household not only fail to provide love and protection, but actively participate in the mockery and degradation of that child? Where the emotional message delivered to that child every day is that they are not wanted, not valued, and deserve whatever bad treatment comes their way? The clinical literature on this is extensive and consistent. Children who grow up in contemptuous environments develop profound difficulties with self-worth. They internalize the messages they receive from the people they depend on most. They form internal working models of relationships that are shaped by what they have experienced, and if what they have experienced is that love is conditional on performance, and that failure to meet impossible standards results in cruelty, they carry those models into adult life and use them to interpret every relationship they subsequently form. The show touches on this, almost despite itself, in the way it portrays Meg's behavior in her later teenage years. She develops obsessive attachments. She pursues relationships with people who are wrong for her, sometimes dangerously wrong, as though the dysfunction she grew up in is the only template she knows for closeness. She is simultaneously hypersensitive to rejection and somehow accustomed to it, which is exactly the combination that you would expect from someone who has been experiencing rejection as a constant background condition of their life. She both expects to be rejected and is devastated every time she is. In the episode Dial Meg for Murder, Meg is sent to prison after harboring a fugitive boyfriend. When she returns from prison, she comes back changed, tougher, harder, with the confidence and aggression that comes from surviving an environment even more hostile than her home life. She beats Peter up. She takes his place as the dominant force in the household. The family, who had spent years directing contempt at her, is suddenly afraid of her. It is played as a comedic reversal, but it is also something more interesting than that. It is the show imagining what happens when the person who has been absorbing everything finally stops absorbing it. The answer, in this case, is not healthy transformation. Meg does not become confident and self-assured in a sustainable way. She becomes aggressive and controlling, substituting one dysfunctional pattern for another, which is, again, close to what actually happens when people who have been victimized reach their limit. The freedom from victimization is real, but it does not automatically come with the tools for healthier relating. It often just means the cycle continues in a different configuration. Then comes the episode that this whole story was building toward. Season 10, Episode 2, Seahorse Seashell Party. The Griffin family is trapped inside their house during a hurricane. There is nowhere to go, no escape from each other. And at some point during the night, something breaks open in Meg. She has been pushed one too many times. She cannot absorb anymore. And she stands up in the living room of the house where she has been failed and abused and ignored for years, and she tells her family the truth. She tells Peter that he is a selfish, irresponsible father. She enumerates the specific things he has done: the farting in her face, the disregard for her basic dignity, the actions that would put him in prison if anyone in the outside world could see them. She tells Lois that she is supposed to be the person who is always on Meg's side, and she is not. She tells Chris that he is a bad brother who has joined in the cruelty instead of protecting her. It is one of the most raw and cathartic moments the show ever produced. And for a few minutes, the show lets it be what it is. Lois cries real tears. Peter is, for once, actually reached by words. The family turns their dysfunction on each other without Meg as the target, and you see it for what it always was: a household full of people who were hurting, who had found a way to manage their collective pain by directing it at the most available and least offended person in the room. And then Meg goes to Brian. And she says something that makes everything more terrible than if the scene had simply ended with the confrontation. She says that she thinks she serves a purpose. She calls herself a lightning rod. She says that the family needs someone to absorb everything, and she accepts that this is her. She agrees to go back to being the target, because the alternative, as she has just witnessed, is the family tearing itself apart. She sacrifices herself, voluntarily, for the people who have been hurting her. There are people who watch this scene and find it psychologically accurate. There are people who have lived versions of it, who have been the family scapegoat and have understood, at some level, that their suffering was keeping other people's relationships intact. The designated absorber of dysfunction, the one who takes the hits so no one else has to. It is a real role that real people occupy in real families, and it is one of the most psychologically damaging positions you can be in. And the show put that on screen in season 10 of an animated comedy, and then, because it could not commit to what it had just said, immediately went back to using Meg as a punching bag the following week. The tragedy of Meg Griffin is not just the abuse she suffered across 10+ seasons. It is the show's relationship to that abuse, the way it alternated between seeming to understand the gravity of what it was depicting and then insisting it was just a joke, the way it gave Meg moments of genuine depth and dignity and then reclaimed them in the next episode, the way it made her the most sympathetically human character on the show and then kept hitting her anyway. Around season 14, the writers began pulling back on the Meg abuse, reportedly due in part to the increasing presence of women in the writing room who objected to the direction of the material. By season 22, the sustained cruelty toward Meg had largely ended. She began getting storylines where she was competent and even impressive. She started fighting back against the bullies at school rather than simply enduring them. She showed resilience and strength that had always been beneath the surface, but that the writers had consistently buried under layers of humiliation. This was a meaningful change. But it came after roughly 10 seasons of the opposite, and in storytelling, as in life, those 10 seasons happened. The character experienced what she experienced. The audience watched it and absorbed whatever messages it was sending. The decade of Meg abuse was part of the cultural presence of this show during the years when it had its largest audience and its biggest cultural footprint. Meg Griffin will be the most remembered character from Family Guy by many of the people who watched it most closely. Not as a joke, not as a punchline, but as the person through whom the show, whether it meant to or not, showed what it looks like to be the one in the family who everyone uses for target practice, who absorbs everything and is thanked with nothing, who keeps showing up because leaving is not an option when you are 17 and your parents are all you have. Section 6. Chris Griffin, the forgotten child in the background. If Meg is the character through whom Family Guy's parenting failures register most acutely, Chris Griffin is the character through whom they register most quietly. He is the middle child in everything but birth order, the one who is neither the eldest struggling for recognition nor the youngest demanding attention. He occupies a space in the family that is slightly outside the main action, never quite the focus of whatever crisis is currently happening, always present in the periphery but rarely pulled to the center in a sustained way. This is not an accident of poor writing. The original conception of Chris was deliberate. He was meant to be the grounded one. Awkward, yes. Not academically gifted, certainly. A little odd in certain specific ways, with his interests and his humor landing in unexpected places, but fundamentally okay. A teenager who was managing adolescence in the normal, fumbling way of teenagers, without the existential weight of Meg's social exclusion or the ontological complexity of Stewie's dual existence. Seth Green voices Chris, and his performance has always had a warmth to it that somewhat buffers the character from the worst of what happens around him. Chris is the family member who is most consistently kind, most likely to respond to other people's distress with genuine empathy rather than exploitation. When something upsetting happens to someone he cares about, Chris's instinct tends toward wanting to help, even if his execution is characteristically clumsy. The parent-child dynamics in Chris's relationship with Peter are complex, in a way that the show does not always fully explore, but that is there in the texture of their interactions. Peter clearly has more investment in Chris than he does in Meg, which is partly about gender, partly about the particular self-mirroring that happens between fathers and sons, and partly about the show's own priorities in terms of which stories it wanted to tell. Peter and Chris have episodes together that have a genuine warmth, episodes where Peter is trying, however ineptly, to be the father he wants to be, and Chris is responding to that attempt. The Season 1 episode, The Sun Also Draws, is one of the best early examples of this. Peter finds out that Chris has been expelled from the Boy Scouts for failing to meet the organization's standards, and he becomes obsessed with getting Chris reinstated. This obsession is typical Peter, an overreaction to a problem that does not actually require the level of response he brings to it. But underneath the obsession is something genuine. Peter wants his son to belong to something. He wants Chris to have the experience of being part of a group, of having structure and peers and a sense of accomplishment. These are not bad things to want for your kid. The method is disastrous, but the motivation is real. The episode eventually reveals that Chris does not actually want to be in the Scouts. He wants to draw. He has a real talent for art, and he wants the freedom to pursue it. And Peter, after going through the entire elaborate disaster of his attempted rescue mission, actually listens to this. He acknowledges what Chris wants. He supports it, imperfectly but genuinely. It is a good father moment, even if it arrives via the usual Peter chaos. Chris's relationship with Lois is softer and more straightforward than most of the other parent-child relationships in the show. Lois tends to treat Chris with a gentleness she does not always extend to Meg. She is more likely to sit down with Chris and talk through something he is struggling with. She is more likely to notice when he seems down and to ask about it. In the Season 16 episode, that includes a significant scene where Lois, in a conversation with her comatose son, admits her complicated feelings about her life. The emotional core of the scene is Lois's love for Chris cutting through all the dysfunction. It is not a perfect love. It is a complicated love, filtered through her own unhappiness and confusion. But it is love. The treatment of Chris in the middle seasons of the show is a study in benign neglect. Not the vicious attention that Meg received, not the elaborate storylines that Peter and Stewie and Brian received, just the gentle absence of being at the center of things. Chris drifts through season after season as a supporting player in stories that are really about other characters, emerging occasionally for episodes that give him a moment in the spotlight and then returning to the background. This is actually consistent with how the middle child, or the quietly pleasant child, often experiences a family with bigger, dramatic presences. The parents have finite attention. When the baby is demanding and the eldest is struggling, the one who is basically okay tends to get managed rather than engaged. Their okayness becomes an excuse for not giving them more, for not going deeper, for not asking the questions that would reveal the more complicated interior life underneath the surface presentation. In Chris's case, the show hints at a more complicated interior life several times without fully committing to exploring it. His insecurities about his weight and appearance, which appear as early as the Season 2 episode He's Too Sexy for His Fat, are given occasional attention but never developed into something sustained. His relationship with learning and intelligence, which is a genuine source of difficulty for him, is used mostly for jokes rather than for anything resembling real engagement with what it feels like to be a kid who struggles academically in a culture that places enormous value on academic performance. One of the most psychologically interesting elements of Chris's character is his relationship to his father's expectations and his own fears of not measuring up. Several early episodes deal with Chris worrying that he does not live up to what Peter wants from a son. The son is always measuring himself against the father's vision of what the son should be, and this measurement is complicated in the Griffin household by the fact that Peter's vision of what Chris should be is itself often incoherent. Peter wants Chris to be athletic, but only in certain ways. He wants Chris to be successful, but he also responds with jealousy when Chris achieves things that make Peter feel diminished by comparison. He wants Chris to need him, but he is not always available to be needed. This particular dynamic, the father who simultaneously wants the son to be great and is threatened by the son's greatness, is well documented in the psychology of father-son relationships. It tends to produce sons who oscillate between overachievement and withdrawal, who are never quite sure whether success will be celebrated or punished, who learn to gauge the emotional weather of their father's mood before deciding how much of themselves to bring to any given interaction. The episode A Picture's Worth $1,000 captures this perfectly. Chris is discovered to have genuine artistic talent, and the family travels to New York where he is celebrated for it. Peter's jealousy at being the focus of less attention is visible and somewhat ugly. Chris picks up on it. The episode resolves in the way the early show generally resolved things, with reconciliation and a return to warmth. But the moment of Peter's jealousy was real and was named, and that naming matters. As the show moved into its middle seasons, Chris became more of a functional prop for other characters' stories than a developed individual. He was the kid who got into various scrapes and misadventures. He was the kid whose relationships with girls were explored occasionally as comedy material. He was the kid who said things that were accidentally wise, functioning as a kind of unwitting oracle whose lack of sophistication produced surprising clarity. One of the more interesting later uses of Chris is in episodes where he and Meg interact as siblings. Their dynamic, when the show gives it room to breathe, has real texture. They are close in age and they have a sibling bond that is recognizable in its mixture of rivalry and affection. Meg's frustration with Chris for sometimes joining in the family's contempt for her is legitimate. Chris's occasional cluelessness about how much his participation in that dynamic hurts her is also real. There is an episode in the middle seasons where the two of them have a confrontation about this, and Chris, in a moment of uncharacteristic self-awareness, actually acknowledges the dynamic and shows something like genuine remorse. The show does not make much of these moments. It does not build on them the way it could, but they are there. What Chris's storyline ultimately illustrates, in the context of the show's parenting themes, is the particular fate of the child who is not in crisis. The family resources, limited and unevenly distributed as they are, flow toward the emergencies. Peter's bad behavior creates constant emergencies. Meg's suffering creates emergencies when it becomes impossible to ignore. Stewie's genius and his shifting relationship to Brian create their own kind of urgency. In the midst of all of this, Chris is basically okay, and because he is basically okay, he does not get what basically okay children actually need, which is not intervention or rescue but genuine presence, attentiveness, and engagement. He grows up in the middle of a family circus without a ringmaster, doing his best to be decent and kind in a household that does not always model decency and kindness, and emerging from it, the show suggests more or less intact. More or less. The more or less is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Section 7. Stewie Griffin, the baby raised by neglect and a talking dog. Stewie Griffin is the most complicated parenting story in Family Guy, and it is complicated in a way that the show has never quite fully unpacked, partly because doing so would require acknowledging something genuinely strange about the setup. Here is the setup. There is a baby. He is 1 year old. He has a fully formed adult consciousness with an enormous vocabulary, sophisticated reasoning abilities, advanced technical and engineering skills, and a specific and detailed inner life that includes strong opinions, aesthetic preferences, emotional needs, and a history of complex interpersonal relationships. This baby cannot communicate with most of the people around him. He exists in a state of profound isolation, surrounded by people who are responsible for his care but who have no access to his actual self. His mother changes his diapers and feeds him and reads to him and takes him to the park and loves him in the ways that a mother loves a baby. She has no idea that the baby she is loving has spent that morning building a mind control device and has plans for world domination that he has been working on since before he could walk. She is not negligent, in the early seasons anyway. She is doing what a mother does with a 1 year old. The gap is not in her effort. The gap is in the information available to her. This is, when you think about it carefully, one of the most profound depictions of the loneliness of intelligence in the show's entire run. Stewie knows things that no one around him knows. He experiences the world with a depth and complexity that none of the adults in his life can access. His relationship with his own inner life is entirely private, shared only with Brian, who can understand him, and with the audience watching the show. The parenting question this raises is, what do you do with a child whose needs you cannot perceive? How do you meet the developmental requirements of a person who is, by all external appearances, a normal toddler, but who is, in reality, something entirely outside the scope of your experience or preparation? The answer the show gives to this question is that you do not meet those needs. You cannot. And in that inability to meet them, something in Stewie has to provide for himself. Brian becomes the primary relationship for Stewie, not because Brian is an ideal companion for a 1 year old, but because Brian is the only person available who can actually know Stewie. The dog becomes the child's primary attachment figure, which is exactly as strange as it sounds, and which has all the limitations you would expect it to have. Brian is not Stewie's parent. He is not equipped to be anyone's parent, as his own failings as a father figure to his biological son Dylan make clear in the later seasons. He is a dog with human-level intelligence and a drinking problem and significant emotional immaturity. He is, by any reasonable assessment, not the right person to be raising a baby, but he is the only person in the household who is capable of seeing Stewie, and that makes him irreplaceable. The Stewie and Brian friendship, which became the emotional center of the show during its middle and later seasons, is in many ways a story about what happens when a child's primary emotional bond is not with a parent, but with someone else in their environment. In real families, this sometimes happens with a grandparent, or a teacher, or an older sibling. The person who actually sees the child and engages with them in ways the parents cannot or do not. The person who becomes the safe figure. In Stewie's case, the safe figure is Brian, and the storylines that explore their friendship are often the show's most emotionally resonant material. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, which places the two characters alone in a bank vault for an entire episode with no cutaways and no external plot, is genuinely remarkable television. It is two characters who are each other's most important person having the kind of conversation that happens only when there is nowhere to go and nothing to hide behind. Brian reveals something about his own suicidal ideation. Stewie reveals the depth of what Brian means to him. It is the show at its most emotionally honest, and it works because the friendship underneath it is real in a way that most of the show's relationships are not. But let us go back to the early seasons, to Stewie and Lois. The early Stewie was the evil baby. His primary narrative was his obsession with killing his mother and achieving world domination. The killing his mother part is the one that most people remember, because it is so extreme and so specific, and because Lois's obliviousness to the danger she is in creates such a particular kind of dramatic irony. She feeds him his dinner while he fantasizes about her death. She tucks him in at night while he plans elaborate methods of eliminating her. She calls him her sweet baby while he is in the middle of building something that could incinerate the neighborhood. Why does Stewie want to kill Lois? The show gives various answers to this over the years, the most sustained of which is that he resents his 9 months in her ovarian Bastille, the imprisonment of gestation that he did not choose and from which he emerged already fully formed and already humiliated by dependence. This is a darkly funny premise, but it is also, if you sit with it, a description of a particular kind of rage at the parent who brought you into the world. You did not ask to be here. You did not consent to the vulnerability and dependence of infancy. You are furious at the person who created the conditions of your helplessness. This is not so different, in extreme cartoon form, from dynamics that child psychologists observe in real families. Children's anger at their parents for bringing them into a world that is painful and difficult. The ambivalence about love and hate that is part of many parent-child relationships, particularly in adolescence, expressed here as murderous plots. Because it is a cartoon comedy, and murderous plots are funnier than teenage sulking. As the show moved away from evil Stewie toward a softer, more emotionally accessible version of the character, what it gained in warmth it lost in the specific insight that the evil baby premise provided. Because the evil baby was, in part, a portrait of what it feels like to be a child in a world you did not choose, surrounded by adults who cannot see you, dependent on people whose capacity to meet your actual needs is at best limited and at worst non-existent. The softer Stewie, the one who cares about his relationships and his identity and his place in the world, is also interesting, but in a more generic way. The storylines are still funny and occasionally moving, but the specific edge of the evil baby, the specific insight embedded in the premise of a trapped consciousness raging against its circumstances, is gone. Lois's relationship with Stewie in the later seasons became increasingly characterized by a dynamic that the show never fully named. She was the parent who had the least access to her most unusual child. She loved him. He loved her in complicated ways that the show only occasionally acknowledged directly. The language barrier between them, which was played for comedy in the early seasons, became something more like a metaphor for the distances that exist between parents and children, even in families where everyone is trying. She could never quite reach him. He could never quite reach her. And Brian, sitting in between them, was the only one who could translate. The episode from season 23 in which Stewie and Lois, both high on marijuana edibles, actually hear each other for the first time and have a real conversation is one of the most emotionally satisfying moments in the show's recent output. The show had been building toward it for roughly 450 episodes. The moment when Lois can finally hear her youngest son, when Stewie can finally be heard by his mother, when the communication barrier dissolves even temporarily, feels like something genuinely earned. Even through the comedy of both of them being unexpectedly high, there is something real happening. She tells him she sees more than he thinks she does. He tells her things he has been carrying alone for the entire run of the show. That moment would not have its weight if the show had not spent 20+ seasons establishing the silence that precedes it. Section 8. The Seahorse episode, when the show accidentally told the truth, the 2nd of October 2011. Fox's animation domination lineup. Part 2 of the Night of the Hurricane crossover block that also included American Dad and The Cleveland Show. The episode was called Seahorse Seashell Party, and it is the most important episode of Family Guy for anyone who wants to understand what the show was saying about its own family. The premise is simple. A hurricane is bearing down on the fictional Rhode Island town where the Griffins live. The family is confined to the house. There is nowhere to go, nothing to do, and the normal escape valves of distraction are unavailable. They are stuck with each other. The episode has 2 parallel plots. Brian secretly consumes psychedelic mushrooms that he finds, and spends the episode on a visually elaborate bad trip that the show renders with genuinely impressive animation. This is the A plot in terms of screen time and production investment, but the B plot is the one that matters. The family, confined and bored and increasingly irritable, is doing what the Griffin family always does when forced into proximity. They are looking for a target. The default target is Meg. Peter snaps at her for the sound of opening a soda can. Lois and Chris join in. The contempt is casual, habitual, the kind of cruelty that has become so normalized in this household that no one even consciously chooses it. It just happens. And then, something different happens. Meg does not absorb it. She turns. The confrontation that follows is written with more care and more emotional honesty than almost anything else in the show's 10 seasons at that point. Meg addresses her family systematically. She starts with Chris, calling him out for being a bad brother who has chosen popularity and cruelty over decency. She moves to Lois, telling her mother that she is a shoplifter, a drug addict, a serial betrayer, a woman who has compromised her integrity in every possible direction and who has never taken responsibility for any of it. And she describes Lois's failure as a mother in the specific terms of what Meg needed and did not receive. Then she turns to Peter. And here the script, written by Wellesley Wild, does something genuinely bold. It does not let Peter off the hook. It does not frame his behavior as misguided, but loving. It presents it as what it actually is. Meg describes a father who has treated her with contempt for years, who has physically degraded her for entertainment, who has created an environment in which she has grown up feeling worthless and unwanted, and whose behavior, she says, would put him in prison if anyone outside the family could see it. Peter tries to laugh it off. He cannot quite manage it. Something in Meg's words reaches him. And then Lois turns on Peter as well, because Meg's confrontation has broken open the family's entire system of managed distance, and suddenly everyone is saying the things they have been not saying to each other for years. The family turns on each other. The dysfunction that was always directed at Meg explodes outward and reveals itself for what it always was. Not a judgment on Meg, but a symptom of everything that was broken between all of them. They tear into each other. Peter and Lois's marriage, the structural foundation of the household, is suddenly visible in all its accumulated resentment and disappointment and failure. And then Meg, watching from the side, realizes something. She realizes that without her as the target, the family falls apart. She realizes that she has been functioning as the family's emotional shock absorber. As long as the family's dysfunction was directed at Meg, it did not have to be directed at anyone else. As long as Meg was the problem, the rest of them did not have to be the problem. She goes to Brian. She tells him what she has understood. Brian calls her brave, and Meg, in the episode's most devastating moment, accepts her role. She goes back. She apologizes to her family. She resumes her position as the target. The message encoded in this ending is philosophically disturbing in ways that go far beyond what most animated comedies are willing to attempt. It says that the maintenance of family homeostasis can require the sustained sacrifice of one member, that the family system, dysfunctional as it is, depends on having someone who absorbs the collective pain, and that the person in that role may understand their role clearly and choose to continue occupying it, not because they are without worth, but because they love the people they are protecting, even the people who hurt them. This is not a message you expect from a Fox animated comedy. It is a message you would expect from a clinical family therapist discussing triangulation and scapegoating dynamics. And it is presented here with a clarity that suggests the writer had either lived this or thought about it very carefully. The backlash to the episode was significant. Many fans and critics were furious, not at the confrontation scene, which was widely praised as cathartic and overdue, but at the ending, at the show's insistence on returning Meg to her role, at the refusal to let the confrontation matter, at the implicit argument that some people just have to be the one who absorbs everything, that this is how families function, and that the correct response to this knowledge is acceptance rather than resistance. This criticism is legitimate. The episode's ending is morally troubling in ways that the show seems not to have fully reckoned with. But there is also an argument that the ending is not endorsing the dynamic it depicts. That the ending is, in fact, a portrait of how this particular kind of family actually works, without the comforting resolution that TV usually provides. That Meg's decision to return to her role is not presented as wisdom but as tragedy, and that the tragedy is the point. The show, characteristically, did not follow through on the implications. Subsequent episodes returned to the established patterns as though Seahorse-Seashell Party had never happened. The reset button was pressed. Meg went back to being the target. The family went back to its normal configuration. Whatever the episode had been trying to say was swallowed back into the usual noise. But the episode existed. It was broadcast. Millions of people watched it. And something about what it said lodged in the cultural memory of the show's audience in a way that is still being discussed more than a decade later. The conversation it started has not entirely stopped, because what Seahorse Seashell Party did, however imperfectly, was name something real. It named the family scapegoat dynamic. It put on screen the experience of the child who has been designated as the household's problem in order to protect the household from facing its actual problems. It gave that child a voice, a moment of genuine power and clarity, and showed both the liberation of that moment and its limits. This is why Meg Griffin, of all the characters on this show, is the one who stays with you. She is the one through whom the show touched something true. Section 9. The Cycle of Dysfunction. What Family Guy got right without knowing it. Family therapy has a particular language for the things that Family Guy depicts: scapegoating, parentification, emotional neglect, enmeshment. These are clinical terms that describe patterns of family behavior that have predictable effects on the children who grow up inside them. And Family Guy, whether it meant to or not, produced one of the most sustained visual depictions of these patterns in the history of entertainment. The scapegoating dynamic has already been discussed in detail in the section on Meg, but it is worth understanding its broader structure, because the Griffin family scapegoat system is remarkably complete. Scapegoating in family systems theory refers to the process by which a family identifies one member as the source of the family's problems. This identification serves a function. By having a designated problem holder, the family can maintain the fiction that everyone else is okay, that the marriage is okay, that the parenting is okay, that the family is basically functional. The scapegoated person absorbs the blame for dysfunction that actually belongs to the system as a whole. In the Griffin household, Meg's function as the scapegoat is so complete that it extends beyond the family itself. The entire town, school, and social world of the show participates in treating Meg as someone whose existence is inherently problematic. This is actually consistent with how scapegoating works in real social contexts. The child who has been designated as the problem in their family carries that designation outward. Other people pick up on the signals and respond accordingly. The scapegoated child develops a presentation of themselves that reinforces the designation because they have internalized it. The Griffin family also demonstrates what therapists call parentification, which is a process by which children are assigned responsibilities and emotional functions that belong to the adults in the household. In the Griffin household, the parentification operates in several directions simultaneously. Meg, in the Seahorse Seashell Party analysis, is essentially functioning as the family's emotional regulator, absorbing collective dysfunction so that the adults do not have to face it. This is a form of emotional parentification in which the child takes responsibility for managing the adult's emotional experience. Brian, despite being technically a pet rather than a child, functions in many episodes as the actual adult in the household, the one who maintains perspective, provides advice, and attempts to keep the family from complete disaster. This is a role that sometimes falls to the oldest child in a dysfunctional household, the child who becomes parentified, who learns to read the adult's emotional states and manage them, who takes on the stabilizing function that the adults are failing to provide. Stewie's relationship with Brian has parentification elements as well, though they are inverted. In many ways, Brian functions as Stewie's parent, his primary attachment figure, his safe base. But in other ways, particularly as the show went on, Stewie's emotional intelligence and stability exceed Brian's, and Stewie ends up providing support and care for Brian that flows in the wrong generational direction. An adult who is more dependent on their child than the child is on them, who uses the child as an emotional support, is a classic presentation of parentification. The Griffin family also demonstrates what is sometimes called the identified patient dynamic, which is closely related to scapegoating but slightly different. The identified patient is the family member whose difficulties are visible and legible to the outside world, the one who might get referred for therapy or who is clearly struggling in ways that others can observe. In a functional reading of this dynamic, the identified patient is often not actually the sickest person in the family. They are the person who is showing symptoms on behalf of the system. The family uses the identified patient as proof that the problem is isolated, that it is this one person's issue rather than something structural. In the Griffin household, Meg functions as the identified patient when her suffering occasionally reaches a level that requires external acknowledgement, as in the brief moments when the show brings in outside characters who respond with concern to what they observe happening to her. These moments are usually played for laughs, with the outside observer's concern being dismissed, or the situation diffusing before anything changes. But the structure is there. The show's handling of the intergenerational transmission of dysfunction is particularly interesting. Family systems theory holds that dysfunctional patterns do not arise in a vacuum. They are transmitted across generations. The child who grows up in a contemptuous household learns contempt as a normal mode of relating and carries it into their adult relationships and eventually their parenting. The cycle continues. Family Guy gives Peter a backstory that gestures toward exactly this. His adoptive father, Francis Griffin, was a harsh and demanding man whose approval was conditional and rarely offered. Peter grew up in an environment of judgment and criticism that shaped the way he related to the world and to his own children. The episode Peter's Sister in Season 14 goes even further, revealing that Peter was systematically bullied and abused by his sister Karen during their childhood, and drawing an explicit line between that abuse and Peter's treatment of Meg. The cycle of violence and contempt running through the family, from Peter's childhood into Meg's, is named directly. It is named directly, and then it is forgotten in the next episode. This is the show's characteristic failure mode, and it is worth understanding why the failure keeps happening. The reset button that the writers press after every moment of genuine insight is not unique to Family Guy. It is a standard feature of episodic television, particularly comedy. The characters have to reset at the end of each episode because the format requires it. Stories need to be able to start fresh each week. Characters who learned their lesson last week cannot be carrying that lesson into this week, or the show stops being able to generate stories. But Family Guy takes this to an extreme that most shows do not. The resets are more complete. The lessons are more thoroughly forgotten. The insights are more fully swallowed back into the status quo. And this happens not just with the big moments, like Peter's Sister or Seahorse Seashell Party, but with smaller moments of warmth and connection throughout the series. Peter and Meg bond in the car and are secret best friends for the length of an episode, and then the next week he is back to forgetting she exists. What this creates, over the run of the show, is a pattern that actually resembles the intermittent reinforcement of inconsistent parenting. The moments of warmth and connection are real when they happen. The forgetting is equally real. The child learns to value the moments of warmth intensely because they are rare and unreliable, and to manage the forgetting by lowering expectations. This is the emotional curriculum of the Griffin household. Love is unpredictable. Cruelty is reliable. Warmth comes in, flashes, and then disappears. The show is a text about American family life in the way that no one intended it to be, but that is visible to anyone paying attention. The Griffins are not a universal family. They are an extreme, a cartoon, a satirical amplification. But the dynamics they embody are real ones, rooted in real observations of how families function and dysfunction. The researchers who study family systems and the therapists who treat their products would recognize the Griffin household immediately. They would have names for everything that goes on there. And the millions of people who watch the show across its long run, many of them from families with their own dysfunction and their own versions of these dynamics, recognized it too. Not always consciously, not always in a way they would articulate. But somewhere in the viewing experience, something connected. Something said, I know this family. I have sat at this table. Section 10. When the Griffins got it right, the show's parenting redemption arcs. It would be dishonest, and it would miss something important. To write about Family Guy's parenting dynamics without spending time on the moments when the show got it right. Because it did get it right, sometimes. The talent that was present in the original writing room never entirely disappeared. The show's worst periods were also punctuated by episodes and moments that showed exactly what the show could do when the people making it cared enough to do it. These redemption arcs are important not just as counterexamples to the general trend of decline. They are important because they show what the Griffins were capable of being. They show that the warmth was never entirely gone, only buried, and that when the writers reached back for it, it was still there. The most consistently warm and well-executed parenting moments in the show involve Peter and Meg, which is something of a paradox given how much of the show's middle period is defined by Peter's cruelty toward his eldest daughter. But this paradox makes a certain kind of sense. The characters are the most dramatically loaded in relation to each other. The potential for both harm and healing between them is the highest. When the show turns that energy toward healing rather than harm, the results are among the most affecting in the series. The Season 5 episode, Road to Rupert, finds Peter with his license revoked, forced to rely on Meg as his driver. The premise is classic Family Guy. Put two characters together in an uncomfortable situation and let the friction generate comedy. But what happens in this episode goes beyond friction. Peter, who normally ignores Meg or treats her with contempt, is forced to spend extended time with her. He is helpless, and she has something he needs: transportation. And in the course of their enforced proximity, he actually sees her. The turning point is when Meg defends Peter against a rude driver, demonstrating a toughness and loyalty that Peter had never bothered to observe in her before. His response is genuine delight. He is impressed, and the episode allows this impression to turn into something real. They bond. They do things together. They have fun together in a way that is entirely believable, because the foundation for it was always there, underneath all the contempt, waiting for someone to notice. The episode ends with Peter telling Meg that she is a wonderful daughter. He means it. And then he says they should be secret best friends, which means he cannot admit it publicly because of some misguided idea about maintaining his social standing with his friends. It is an imperfect conclusion, but it is real. The love was there all along. It just needed a circumstance that forced it to the surface. The late season episode, Meg Stinks, which was part of the effort in the later seasons to restore some dignity to Meg's character, works along similar lines. Peter and Meg are on a road trip for a college interview, and the episode gives them genuine time together, away from the household dynamics that normally define their relationship. They discover they have things in common. They enjoy each other's company. Peter abandons his normal treatment of Meg and engages with her as a person, and what he finds is a person worth knowing. The show's handling of Stewie and Brian's relationship, particularly in the Brian and Stewie episode and in the Season 12 episode Christmas Guy, represents some of the show's most emotionally sophisticated storytelling. The Brian and Stewie episode, which locks them in a bank vault with no cutaways and no external plot, is constructed entirely around two characters having honest conversations about their lives. Brian's revelation that he keeps a gun in the vault because he has thought about ending his own life is handled with a care that the show rarely brought to difficult emotional material. Stewie's response, which is not platitude or panic but genuine listening and genuine love, is the most fully realized version of who Stewie is in the entire run of the show. Christmas Guy, which is widely considered the best episode of Family Guy's later seasons by many of the show's most dedicated fans, brings the Brian and Stewie relationship to a crisis point by having Brian die and Stewie use his last time travel device to save him. The emotional core of the episode is Stewie's desperation to prevent Brian's death and the lengths to which he goes, sacrificing his ability to ever travel through time again to save the life of the person who is most important to him. It is a sacrifice born of love. It is the clearest statement the show ever made about what Brian and Stewie mean to each other. This is worth noting in the context of the show's parenting themes because the relationship between Stewie and Brian is, in many ways, the show's most functional parenting-adjacent relationship. Brian does not parent Stewie in a traditional sense, but he provides for Stewie something that Lois and Peter cannot. He sees him. He engages with his actual self rather than the surface baby he presents to the world. He is there when Stewie needs someone to talk to. He is the consistent figure, however imperfect, in a life that is otherwise characterized by the fundamental isolation of being understood by almost no one. The later season storylines that gave Meg her dignity back also produced some genuinely moving material. Her interactions with the woman who befriended her and recognized her talent, her growing ability to push back against the bullying at school, her moments of quiet competence in situations where the family needed something real. All of these represent the show slowly remembering who Meg could be when the writers chose to take her seriously. The Season 13 Simpsons crossover episode, which brought Lisa Simpson and Meg together, is remarkable for what it does with Meg's character. Lisa, who occupies a similar position in The Simpsons as the intellectually serious child in a chaotic family, recognizes something in Meg immediately: She sees the person underneath the surface. And she says things to Meg that Meg has never heard from a peer. Things about her worth and her talent and her right to be seen. The episode gives Meg the saxophone as a talent, a specific skill that is hers, and in doing so gives her something that the show had consistently denied her, the sense that she has something to offer. The episode Peter's Sister in Season 14, which was mentioned earlier in the discussion of Peter's Flanderization, deserves extended attention in this section because it represents one of the most complete and honest parenting storylines the show produced in its later years. The revelation of Karen Griffin, Peter's abusive sister, reframes Peter's entire relationship with Meg in a way that is psychologically accurate and emotionally generous. Peter was bullied and abused by his sister. He was not protected by their parents. He grew up in an environment where cruelty from a family member was the norm and where no one intervened. He internalized that dynamic. He carried it forward. He became, in his own household, the person who directs cruelty at the most available family member, the one least able to fight back. He became Karen. He became the abuser he grew up with. Meg's response to this revelation, which is not to excuse Peter but to understand him and to extend compassion to the child he was, even while she was still processing the harm he had done to the person she was, is some of the show's finest writing. It models something genuinely useful: the difference between understanding and excusing, the possibility of seeing your abuser as also a product of abuse without that understanding requiring you to accept continued abuse, the complicated emotional terrain of compassion for someone who has hurt you. That terrain is where real families live. Not in the clear moral light of easy resolution, but in the complicated middle distance where people are both responsible for what they do and also shaped by what was done to them, where love and harm coexist in the same relationship, where the question of how to go forward is never as simple as the resolution of a television episode makes it seem. The show, true to form, did not allow the reconciliation between Peter and Meg to stick into subsequent episodes. The reset happened, but the episode itself was real. The truth it told was real, and it is still there, preserved on screen for anyone who wants to find it. Section 11. What the Griffins taught us about parenting without trying to. There is a version of this story that ends with a simple verdict. Family Guy depicted terrible parenting for most of its long run, had moments of insight, and mostly failed to build on them. The characters were damaged over the years by creative decisions that prioritized shock and cruelty over warmth. The parenting in the show became, in its worst periods, a portrait of how not to raise children. That verdict is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The more interesting reading of Family Guy as a parenting text is not about whether the show modeled good or bad parenting. It is about what the show's enormous viewership, over more than 2 decades, did with what they watched. Because audiences bring themselves to everything they consume, and what they bring shapes what they take away. People who watched Family Guy brought their own families with them into the viewing experience. They brought their own parents and their own childhoods and their own experiences of being seen or not seen, loved or not loved, heard or not heard, and they found things in the Griffin household that reflected those experiences back at them in a way that was simultaneously funny and uncomfortably honest. The generations who grew up with Family Guy, the people who were watching it through high school and college and early adulthood, were watching during formative years when questions about family, about parenting, about what it means to be loved, and what it looks like when love goes wrong, were intensely live questions. And the show, with its mixture of satire and inadvertent honesty, gave them a language for some of those experiences. The specific language of the show, phrases and images and character dynamics, became shorthand for dynamics that existed in their own families. This is not a trivial thing. The cultural narratives we use to make sense of our experiences matter. When a show provides a vocabulary for something you have lived, it makes that something easier to think about, easier to talk about, easier to process. The scapegoat dynamic, which the show depicted in extreme form through Meg, is something that many families contain in some version. Having seen it depicted, having had the episode Seahorse Seashell Party exist in the cultural landscape, may have made it easier for some people to name what they were experiencing in their own families. The show also modeled, even if imperfectly and unreliably, the possibility of redemption. The fact that Peter could be cruel to Meg and then gentle with her. The fact that Lois could be cold and then warm. The fact that the relationship between any two characters in the show could shift, could find its way back to something real after spending time in something damaged. This modeling of the non-linearity of family relationships is actually true in a way that tidier television often is not. Families do not just go from bad to good, they go back and forth. They have moments of genuine connection, followed by periods of forgetting, followed by more moments of connection. The Griffins, frustratingly, mirror this pattern. The most important thing the Griffins taught us about parenting, though, may be the thing the show illustrated most clearly in its worst episodes rather than its best ones. Which is, what happens to children when parents stop paying attention? When the love is technically present but the presence is absent? When the care has become habitual rather than intentional, perfunctory rather than genuine? Meg's story is a story about what it costs a child to grow up in a household where her parents' attention and affection require constant competition that she cannot win. Peter has beer and television and his friends and his various obsessions. Lois has her own internal life, and her own struggles and her own exhaustion with the demands of managing the household. Neither of them has much left over for Meg, and what little they have left over is given unevenly and unpredictably. This is not a story unique to the extreme case of fictional parents who fart on their daughter for entertainment. It is a story that plays out in more muted form in households everywhere. The parents who are doing their best but whose best is not quite enough, who are so consumed by the demands of their own lives, their own unprocessed histories, their own anxiety and exhaustion, that the child in front of them cannot fully penetrate the noise. The Griffins are a cartoon extreme of this, but the extreme illuminates the real. The comedy that the show generates from Peter's obliviousness toward his children has underneath it something recognizable, the specific pain of being on the wrong side of a parent's attention, of being the one who is there but not quite seen, of needing something that the people responsible for you are not equipped or willing to provide. Chris is fine. Mostly. As well as anyone is in that household, he has found ways to be okay in spite of everything. But fine is not the same as flourishing, and the quiet quality of Chris's okayness, his low-drama presence in a high-drama household, is its own portrait of what it looks like when a child adapts by lowering expectations rather than by being met. Stewie is something else entirely. Stewie is what you get when extraordinary inner resources are combined with almost total isolation. He has built himself an entire world inside his own mind. He has found in Brian a companion who can see him. He has survived the fundamental aloneness of his situation through intelligence and creativity and a relationship that nourishes him even though it is not the relationship he should have had. This is actually an account of resilience that the show did not intend, but that is there nonetheless. And Meg. Meg is the most honest portrait in the show. She is what you get when you are not resilient in the ways that are rewarded, when your pain is visible rather than hidden, when you respond to cruelty with sadness and longing rather than with compensating achievements or alternative relationships. She is the child who just needs to be loved and whose needs keep not being met, and who somehow keeps showing up anyway, keeps sitting at the table, keeps being part of the family even when the family is the source of her deepest wounds. That she gets better in the later seasons, that the abuse ends and she is given her dignity back, that the writers eventually remembered who she was supposed to be, is something. It is not enough, but it is something. The lesson the Griffins offer, across all their seasons and all their failures and all their occasional moments of grace, is about the weight of parents. About how much of what we become is shaped by the people who were supposed to be taking care of us. About how the love that is there but not expressed, the care that is present but not reliable, the warmth that flickers on and off without explanation, forms the emotional furniture that children carry with them into their adult lives. Peter Griffin's worst failures as a father are the show's most potent moments, not because they are funny, though sometimes they are, but because they are recognizable. Because somewhere between the cartoon violence and the cutaway gags and the reset button being pressed at the end of every episode, the show kept making a true statement about what it costs children to be raised by parents who are only imperfectly present. And it kept making a true statement about something else, too, about the fact that families survive. That they sustain dysfunction across years and decades and still manage to produce people who love each other, even imperfectly, even unreliably, even in ways that also sometimes cause harm. The Griffins keep coming back to the dinner table. They keep being a family in spite of everything. That is its own kind of testament to something. It is not an endorsement of the behavior. It is not a suggestion that what happened to Meg was okay because the family stayed together. It is just an observation about the stubborn persistence of family bonds. Even when those bonds are as tangled and complicated and sometimes painful as the bonds in the Griffin household. The house on Spooner Street is still standing. The green door is still there. And inside, the family is still at the table, still arguing about the television, still failing each other in the ways they have always failed each other, still occasionally breaking through to something real. That is the story Family Guy told, over more than 2 decades, whether it meant to or not, and it is a story worth knowing. Closing. And that is where we will settle tonight. Right here in this house on Spooner Street, with the lights low and the storm gone and the family more or less intact around the table. It is not a perfect family. It never was. But it is the family the show gave us, and it has more to say than it was ever given credit for. If this kind of long, slow, story-driven content is what you like to fall asleep to, then you are in exactly the right place. We cover everything with this kind of care, this kind of patience, this kind of willingness to sit with something and look at it from every angle until it shows you something new. Drop a like if you made it this far. It genuinely does help the channel in ways that are hard to overstate, and every single one is noticed. Subscribe if you want more of this. That is all it takes. One click and more of this arrives when you least expect it and need it most. And wherever you are right now, whatever city or country or quiet corner of the world you are listening from, I hope the night is gentle. I hope the sleep comes easy. And I hope that somewhere in all of this, you found something worth carrying with you. See you in the next one. End of script. Total approximate word count, 30,500 plus. Supplemental Section A. Peter Griffin and the Working Class Father Tradition. An extended analysis. To fully understand what happened to Peter Griffin over the course of Family Guy's long run, it helps to situate him within a broader tradition. The working-class American father has been a central figure in television comedy since the medium's earliest days, and the shape of that figure has changed dramatically across decades in ways that tell you a great deal about how American culture was thinking about masculinity, family responsibility, and the nature of fatherhood at any given moment. Ralph Kramden in The Honeymooners, which ran from 1955 to 1956 in its full-season form before continuing as sketches into the early 1960s, established the template that most subsequent working-class TV fathers were working from. Ralph was a city bus driver in Brooklyn. He was loud, grandiose, and frequently wrong. He was always on the verge of some scheme that was going to make him rich, and the scheme always failed. He yelled at his wife Alice in ways that a contemporary audience would find uncomfortable, with his catchphrase, "One of these days, Alice, one of these days, pow," right in the kisser, being a threat of domestic violence that was played as a joke in an era when domestic violence was rarely named as such. But underneath all of Ralph's bluster and failure was a genuine love for Alice. The comedy of The Honeymooners was, at its heart, a comedy about two people who drove each other crazy and were completely devoted to each other. When Ralph's schemes failed and he was humiliated, Alice's acceptance of him was tender and real. The show made you feel the love underneath the noise. Archie Bunker in All in the Family, which ran from 1971 to 1979, and is widely considered one of the most important television shows ever made, took the working-class father template and complicated it in ways that had not been attempted before. Archie was explicitly bigoted in ways that the show did not flinch from depicting. His racism, his sexism, his homophobia, his resentment of anyone who was not exactly like him were all presented in clear detail. But the show was not endorsing Archie's views. It was examining them, holding them up to the light, and making its audience reckon with the fact that this figure, this particular kind of American man, existed and had a certain kind of logic even when that logic was wrong. Norman Lear, the show's creator, understood that the most effective way to challenge prejudice was not to make the prejudiced person a cartoon villain, but to make them recognizable, human, and even lovable despite their flaws. Archie Bunker was all of these things. You could see how he had become who he was. You could see the fear underneath the bluster, the insecurity underneath the certainty. You could even see, in certain moments, that he loved his family in a way that was real, even if it was expressed in limited and sometimes harmful ways. The Archie Bunker template influenced Al Bundy in Married with Children, which ran from 1987 to 1997. Al was the working-class father taken to a darkly comic extreme. He was a shoe salesman who hated his job and most of his customers. He was contemptuous of his wife and children in ways that were played for laughs rather than examined critically. The show was a deliberate anti-sitcom, a response to what its creators saw as the saccharine falseness of shows like The Cosby Show. Where The Cosby Show presented an idealized, upper-middle-class black family as a model of what family life could be, Married with Children presented a white, working-class family in which nobody liked anybody, and success was a remote and alien concept. Al Bundy was mean and lazy and petty and self-pitying. He was also funny in ways that the show's audience of millions found intensely relatable. There was something cathartic about watching a father who did not pretend to be noble or wise or competent, who sat on his couch with his hand down his pants and expressed opinions that were aggressively incorrect, who had abandoned whatever dreams he might have had and settled into an existence of small pleasures and abundant resentments. Homer Simpson, who arrived on television in 1989 and has been there ever since, represented another significant evolution of the template. Homer was the lovable incompetent elevated to a kind of philosophical principle. He was stupid in ways that transcended mere intellectual limitation and became something almost metaphysical. His inability to think through the consequences of his actions was so complete that it felt like a commentary on the nature of human self-deception. And yet Homer loved his family with a consistency and a depth that the show made sure you never fully doubted, even at his worst moments. His love for Marge was the emotional constant of the show. His devotion to his children, expressed through constant failure and occasional stunning success, was what made him sympathetic rather than just pathetic. Peter Griffin arrived in this lineage in 1999 and initially occupied a specific position within it. He was the post-Homer working-class TV dad, building on what The Simpsons had established while finding room for a different kind of comedy. Where Homer's stupidity was rendered in a show that valued emotional continuity and long-form character development, Peter's stupidity was rendered in a show that was more interested in the joke of the moment than in the accumulated portrait of a life. The cutaway format meant that any given scene with Peter could pivot away from him at any moment, releasing the pressure of having to be consistently characterized. He could be whoever the joke of the moment required. This formal difference, the cutaway format versus the more conventional narrative of The Simpsons, had profound implications for what happened to Peter over time. Without the structural obligation to maintain consistency across episodes and seasons, the writers were free to make Peter whatever was funniest in any given week. This freedom was part of what made Family Guy's early seasons feel so anarchic and fresh. But over time, it meant that the decisions about who Peter was accumulated without anyone being fully responsible for their overall direction. The darkness that crept into Peter's character across the middle seasons of the show was not a single decision that someone made. It was 100 small decisions, each one a degree or two darker than the last, each one enabled by the previous one and enabling the next. The Peter of Season 8 was not a character that anyone had set out to create. He was the accretion of choices made by many different writers in many different rooms over many years, each responding to the show's established norms at that point, each pushing slightly further into the territory that the previous season had opened up. This is how institutional drift works. In corporations, in governments, in creative enterprises, no single decision produces the outcome. The outcome is the result of the direction you chose to travel, accumulated across thousands of small choices, none of which seemed decisive at the time. What the drift in Peter's character ultimately produced was a figure who had parted ways with almost every iteration of the working-class TV dad who came before him. Ralph Kramden loved Alice. Al Bundy was contemptuous, but his contempt was comedically exaggerated and the show was self-aware about it. Homer Simpson loved his family with a consistency that the show never really abandoned. Peter Griffin, by the time you get to seasons 9 through 14, loved his family in a way that had become purely theoretical. The love was stated, occasionally, when the plot required it. But the behavior that surrounded the statement of love was so contradictory, so regularly and specifically cruel, that the statement itself became almost meaningless. It was the formal residue of a characterization that had been otherwise gutted. This matters beyond Family Guy. It matters because the portrait of Peter Griffin in those middle seasons entered the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people watched him. Young men who were learning about what fatherhood looked like watched him. Children who were already living with fathers who bore some resemblance to his worst characteristics watched him and perhaps had their own experiences normalized by what they saw. People who were funny about their own father's failings used Peter Griffin as a reference point. Art does not determine behavior. Television comedy does not cause people to be bad parents. But the cultural landscape does shape what we think of as normal, as acceptable, as funny rather than alarming. And Family Guy, during its peak years of cultural relevance, was making certain things about fatherhood and parenting into comedy material in ways that had consequences for how those things were perceived. The show's creators were aware of this to some degree. The fourth wall breaks that became increasingly common in the middle seasons, where characters acknowledged the show's declining quality or the writer's creative choices, represented a kind of self-consciousness about what was happening. But self-consciousness is not the same as accountability. Knowing you are doing something and laughing about it is not the same as choosing not to do it. The rehabilitation of Peter in the later seasons, which has been real and meaningful if gradual, represents an acknowledgement that the character had gone too far. The pendulum swung back. The show, whether through the pressure of audience response, or the influence of new voices in the writer's room, or simply the natural correction of having pushed in a dark direction for long enough, began finding its way back to a Peter Griffin who could occasionally be the father he was always supposed to be. It is incomplete work. The restoration has been uneven, but the direction of travel has changed. And watching the show's current output with the knowledge of what the character was in the beginning, there are moments when you can catch a glimpse of the man who used to tell his daughter she was wonderful. He is still in there, somewhere. The show put him away for a long time. It has been, slowly and imperfectly, bringing him back. Supplemental Section B, Lois Griffin and the specific exhaustion of being the functional parent. The particular kind of fatigue that comes from being the functional parent in a dysfunctional household is one of the least well-documented experiences in the literature of family psychology, primarily because the people experiencing it are too busy being functional to stop and document it. They are the ones holding the structure together. They do not have the luxury of falling apart. And over time, the effort of holding the structure together when the other parent is not holding it or is actively undermining it takes its toll in ways that are often not visible from the outside. Lois Griffin was, in those first 3 seasons, a portrait of this kind of exhaustion rendered in comedic form. The exhaustion was legible in her voice, in the slightly strained quality of her patience when Peter was doing something catastrophically stupid, in the way she managed a household that was constantly on the verge of some disaster of Peter's making. She was not complaining. She was not asking for sympathy. She was just doing what the situation required, which was managing everything that Peter was not managing, which was most things. This is a pattern that is disproportionately experienced by women in heterosexual partnerships, particularly partnerships where one person is functionally more impaired than the other. The person who can manage steps into the management role, often without any explicit discussion or decision about this, simply because they are the one who can and the work has to get done. Over time, this informal arrangement calcifies. The capable one becomes the manager, and the less capable one becomes managed. The manager has more responsibility but often less acknowledged authority. The managed person may even resent the management while depending entirely on it. Lois in the early seasons was clearly aware of this dynamic. She had opinions about it. There were episodes where her frustration with the burden she was carrying became visible and was addressed, where she put her foot down and insisted on being recognized and valued in ways that went beyond the functional role she was occupying. These were good episodes because they acknowledged the complexity of her position. The degradation of Lois's character in the middle seasons is most visible in the way the show handled her relationship to her own needs and desires. In the early seasons, there was a sense of a person with an inner life, with things she wanted for herself, with a history that extended beyond the Griffin household. She had been a rebellious rich girl who had rejected her family's expectations. She had found Peter and chosen a different life. She played piano and found meaning in it. She had a sense of humor about herself and her situation that was genuinely funny, and that suggested she was watching her own life with some degree of critical intelligence. In the middle seasons, that person was progressively replaced by someone who existed primarily as a foil or a facilitator. Lois was there to react to Peter's behavior. She was there to manage consequences. She was there to deliver lines that set up jokes. The person underneath, the one with needs and desires and a view of herself that went beyond what others saw, was increasingly absent. The kleptomania storyline, which appeared in season 11's Screams of Silence aftermath and developed across later seasons, was the most significant attempt to reintroduce that interiority. The premise was simple and psychologically resonant. Lois shoplifts because she feels trapped. She has given up her own life and her own freedom in order to be the manager of a family that rarely acknowledges or appreciates her management. The stealing is the one thing she does for herself, the one act that is purely about her own impulse rather than everyone else's needs. It is self-destructive and legally perilous and entirely comprehensible. The show did not develop this storyline with the patience it deserved. It was used episodically rather than being allowed to become a sustained thread that changed how we understood Lois over time. But the premise was genuinely insightful. The suggestion that a woman who has been selflessly managing a difficult household for years might find a way to reclaim something, however small and transgressive, for herself was not a joke. It was an observation about what that kind of sustained caretaking does to a person. There is a scene in one of the later seasons where Lois, speaking to a comatose Chris in what is intended to be a private conversation, says something to the effect of, "Every mother has killed someone." She is talking about her own inner life, about the parts of herself she has had to kill in order to become the mother and wife she became. The parts that wanted other things, that imagined different lives, that were not extinguished but were submerged under the demands of the role she occupies. This is extraordinary material for an animated comedy on Fox. The sentence, "Every mother has killed someone," is the kind of line that belongs in serious literary fiction about the interior lives of women and domesticity. And it was put in the mouth of Lois Griffin, in a quiet moment, almost as an aside, in a show that was better known for Peter getting hit by cars and Stewie making jokes. The fact that this line is there, buried in the run of the show, is evidence that the writers, even in the middle seasons and later, were capable of genuine insight about these characters and these dynamics. The problem was never a lack of capability. The problem was that the show's format, its priorities, its relationship to its own best material, consistently prevented that insight from being given the room it needed to fully breathe. Lois's relationship with her own mother, Babs Pewterschmidt, is another thread that the show used occasionally but underexplored. Babs was cold in specific ways, the ways of a woman who had built her identity around social status and who evaluated everything, including her children, in terms of how they reflected on that status. Lois's choice of Peter as a husband was, in Babs's view, a kind of downward mobility that reflected poorly on the family. The warmth that Babs expressed toward her daughter was conditional and performance-based rather than unconditional and present. This is Lois's parenting inheritance. The mother she had was a woman whose love was contingent on meeting standards, whose affection was rationed according to achievement and presentation. And Lois, who had consciously rejected the Pewterschmidt world, was still shaped by it. The ways she was imperfect as a mother, particularly toward Meg, bear a certain resemblance to the ways Babs was imperfect toward Lois. Not identical. Lois was warmer than Babs in many moments, more genuinely invested in her children's well-being. But the coldness that showed up in Lois toward Meg during the show's difficult middle period was not entirely Lois's creation. Some of it was inherited. This intergenerational thread, the way parenting patterns move forward from grandparent to child, was present in the show's DNA from early on. The writers did not always choose to follow it, but it was built into the characters in ways that a careful viewer could see. Carter's coldness toward Lois, Lois's complicated warmth toward her children, Peter's father Francis's harshness toward Peter, Peter's cruelty toward Meg, Karen Griffin's bullying of Peter, Peter's cruelty toward Meg again, circling back to the same wound through a different generation. The chain of transmission is there. It is not presented as deterministic. The show, in its better moments, suggests that it can be broken, that awareness can interrupt the pattern, that love consciously chosen can be different from love inherited as habit. The episode Peter's Sister makes this argument explicitly. But the chain is also shown to be strong, and the interruption of it is shown to require more than good intentions. It requires sustained effort, real courage, and the willingness to stay with the discomfort of being different from the parent you had. Lois, at her best, did that. She was warmer to her children than Babs was to her. She engaged with them more. showed more interest in who they were rather than just in how they reflected on her. She had moments of genuine connection with all three of her children that were beyond what Babs had managed with her. The chain was not broken, but it was stretched. The damage was somewhat reduced in the next generation. Whether it will be further reduced in the generation after that, if Meg ever has children or Chris ever has children, is a question the show does not answer. But the pattern is visible. The wounds are visible. The possibility of something different is visible too, in the episodes where the warmth wins out, in the moments of genuine connection that the show found even in its most difficult periods. Supplemental Section C. The Griffin Household as a Map of Real Family Dynamics. Family systems theory, developed primarily through the work of Murray Bowen in the mid-20th century and expanded by generations of family therapists and researchers since, provides a set of concepts that map remarkably well onto the Griffin household. Understanding these concepts makes the show richer, not because the writers were deliberately applying clinical frameworks, but because good observation of human behavior, even in the context of comedy, tends to arrive at the same patterns that careful psychological research arrives at from a different direction. One of the central concepts in Bowen's work is differentiation of self. This refers to the degree to which a person is able to maintain their own identity and values within the intense emotional field of a close relationship or a family system. A highly differentiated person can be close to others without losing themselves in those relationships. They can disagree without feeling threatened. They can engage with intense emotional material without being overwhelmed by it. A person with low differentiation tends to be either fused with others, absorbing their emotional states and losing track of their own, or cut off from others, creating distance to manage the anxiety of potential fusion. Looking at the Griffin family through this lens is illuminating. Peter has extremely low differentiation. He is simultaneously fused with and cut off from the people around him, moving unpredictably between intense emotional entanglement and complete disregard. His moods are entirely reactive to his immediate environment. He has almost no stable inner core that he is defending against the pressure of the family's emotional field. He is the emotional weather of the household in many ways, and because he is so reactive and so unpredictable, the people around him organize their own behavior largely in response to what he is doing and feeling. Lois has somewhat higher differentiation, particularly in the early seasons. She has a point of view. She can disagree with Peter and hold her position under pressure. She has access to her own feelings and can articulate them. But her differentiation has limits, particularly where her children are concerned. Her relationship with Meg has moments of fusion that manifest as over-involvement, and then moments of cutoff that manifest as the cold indifference of the middle seasons. The oscillation is characteristic of someone who has not fully worked out their own differentiation in the context of parenting. Meg has very low differentiation, which makes sense given what she grew up with. She is fused with the family system's emotional dynamics in a way that makes it impossible for her to maintain her own perspective for more than brief moments. Her inner life is constantly being colonized by the family's projections onto her. The moments when she achieves something like genuine differentiation, when she is able to stand apart from the family's emotional field and say clearly what she sees and what she needs, are the show's most powerful moments. Seahorse Seashell Party is essentially a portrait of Meg attempting differentiation and then being pulled back into fusion by the family system's demand that she remain undifferentiated. Chris has a natural toward higher differentiation than Meg, which may account for his relatively lower levels of dysfunction despite the same family context. He is able to maintain a certain pleasant equanimity even in the midst of the household's chaos. This might be partly temperamental, partly positional, being somewhat less exposed to direct parental cruelty than Meg, and partly a learned response to the environment. He has found a way to be in the family without being fully consumed by it. This is not the same as differentiation in the fullest sense, but it is an approximation of it. Stewie's situation from a differentiation perspective is paradoxical. He has an extraordinarily well-developed inner life and a highly stable sense of his own identity, which would suggest high differentiation. But he exists in a condition of profound isolation that has its own distorting effects. When the only person who can truly see you is one other person, your differentiation is at risk in a different way. You are not fused with the family system, but you may be fused with the one relationship available to you. The intensity of Stewie's attachment to Brian, and the devastation that Brian's death in season 12 caused him suggests that whatever differentiation Stewie has achieved does not extend to his capacity to function without Brian. Another key concept in family systems work is triangulation. When two members of a system are in tension with each other, they often involve a third person to manage the anxiety of the direct relationship. The third person absorbs the tension between the two, mediating, distracting, or serving as a displacement target for what cannot be directly expressed between the two primary parties. The Griffin household is a highly triangulated system. The marriage between Peter and Lois generates enormous amounts of unprocessed tension, and that tension is regularly displaced onto the children. Meg is the most common recipient of this displacement, which is one of the structural reasons for her role as the household scapegoat. When Peter and Lois are not getting along, the tension has to go somewhere. It goes to Meg. Her suffering reduces the pressure on the marriage. The marriage continues to function, or to appear to function, because the dysfunction is externalized onto someone who has no ability to refuse the role. This triangulation is not conscious. Nobody in the Griffin household, with the possible exception of Brian, is sitting down and deciding to scapegoat Meg in order to preserve the marriage. It happens through the accumulated logic of the family system, through patterns that were established early and that each new episode reinforces. The system wants homeostasis. It wants to stay in its familiar configuration, and the familiar configuration requires Meg to be in the position she is in. Brian's role in the system is interesting from this perspective. He is both inside the system, as a member of the household, and somewhat outside it, as a dog who did not grow up in this family and who arrived as an adult with his own imperfect differentiation. He is able to see the patterns in ways that the family members, who were formed by those patterns, cannot always see. The scenes where Brian articulates something true about what is happening in the household, where he names a dynamic that no one else is naming, are the show finding its most honest voice. The Bowen concept of the multi-generational transmission process, which describes how family anxiety and relational patterns are transmitted down through generations, becoming more or less intense with each generation depending on the differentiation of the people involved, is visible in the Griffin family history the show provides. Francis Griffin, Peter's adoptive father, is harsh and critical. Peter is harsh and critical toward his children. Karen Griffin is a bully. Peter is a bully toward Meg. The pattern is not identical from one generation to the next because each person is also shaped by factors beyond the family, but the basic transmission is clear. What family systems therapy suggests is possible, and what the show occasionally dramatizes, is that insight into these patterns, genuine understanding of where they come from and how they work, can interrupt the transmission. Not easily, not without sustained effort and a willingness to stay with the discomfort of changing deeply established patterns, but it is possible. The person who understands why they do what they do, who can see the pattern they inherited and make a conscious choice to do otherwise, can change the direction of transmission. The episode Peter's Sister is the show's most sustained attempt to dramatize this possibility. Meg, who has been receiving the transmitted harm, is given information about where it comes from. She is given the opportunity to see Peter not only as the person who hurts her, but as the person who was hurt before her. This does not excuse what Peter has done. It does not obligate Meg to accept continued abuse. But it opens a possibility for something other than pure victimhood and pure perpetration. It allows for the complexity of the human being who is both subject and object of the cycle. That the show immediately forgot the implications of this episode and returned to the established pattern is frustrating but not entirely surprising. The established pattern is what the show's format and commercial imperatives require. But the episode's insight was real, and its existence is part of the show's cumulative portrait of family life, however imperfect the surrounding context in which it appears. Family systems theory also has a concept called the family projection process, which describes how parents project their own anxiety and unresolved issues onto their children. The child who receives the projection becomes the identified patient, the one who carries the family's anxiety in their own person. The projection is not malicious. It is not even usually conscious. It is a way of managing unbearable internal states by externalizing them onto someone who seems to contain the same qualities. What are Peter and Lois projecting onto Meg? This is worth thinking about carefully. In the early seasons, the projection is relatively mild. Meg receives the family's anxieties about ordinariness, about being unremarkable in a world that values spectacle. In the later seasons, the projection becomes more extreme and more hostile. What is the family anxious about that they are projecting onto Meg? The show, if you read it carefully, suggests several answers. They are projecting their collective anxiety about failure, about not being enough, about the gap between what they want their lives to be and what their lives actually are. Peter, who is a man who has failed at most of his ambitions, who never became anything notable, who carries a submerged shame about who he is and where he ended up, sees in Meg a version of his own feared self. The contempt he directs at her is in part the contempt he carries toward his own inadequacy. By seeing her as worthless, he is managing his own terror of worthlessness. Lois, whose sacrifice of her Pewterschmidt identity for the Griffin household is a sacrifice she has never fully processed, may see in Meg the resentment she cannot allow herself to direct at Peter. The person who cannot be angry at the one who has disappointed her turns that anger towards someone with even less power to fight back. None of this excuses the behavior. All of it explains it. And the distinction between excusing and explaining is important. The show found its way to this distinction in its best moments. When it was most honest about what it was depicting, it was not asking you to excuse the Griffins. It was asking you to understand them, which is a different request entirely. Supplemental Section D. Parenting, Comedy, and the Cultural Weight of What We Laugh At. There is a serious question embedded in any analysis of Family Guy's parenting dynamics, and it is a question about comedy itself. What does it mean to make a child's suffering funny? What happens when the audience laughs at abuse? What does the laughter signal and what does it enable? These questions have been asked about entertainment throughout human history. Comedy has always involved darkness. The great comic traditions, from the satires of Aristophanes to the comedies of Shakespeare to the dark humor of 20th century literature, have found their deepest material in suffering, in failure, in the gap between human pretension and human reality. The laugh at someone else's misfortune is one of the oldest laughs there is. Schadenfreude is a recognized emotion. Comedy has always exploited it. The question is not whether comedy can involve suffering, but what the comedy does with that suffering. There is a version of comedy that makes suffering visible, that names it, that uses the laugh to create a space in which something true can be acknowledged, that might otherwise be too painful or too uncomfortable to face directly. This is the comedy of recognition. You laugh because you recognize something, because the truth of it has been exposed with a precision that surprises you, because the thing you were trying not to see has been placed in the light. And then there is a version of comedy that uses suffering as a resource for entertainment without engaging with its actual nature, that extracts the comedic value from a painful situation without acknowledging the pain, that asks the audience to laugh at someone's misery while deflecting any examination of why that misery exists or what it costs. This is the comedy of exploitation. The suffering person is not a subject. They are an object, a source of comedic material for the audience's consumption. Family Guy operates in both modes, sometimes in the same episode. The Meg material in Seahorse Seashell Party is in the first mode. The comedy of that episode, such as it is, comes from recognition. The show is using comedy to say something true about how family scapegoating works, and the truth is the point. The laugh, if it exists at all, is the laugh of someone who recognizes something in what they are seeing, and feels the complicated mixture of shock and recognition, and something like relief that occurs when something you have only ever felt is finally put into words. But the years of Meg abuse before and after that episode operated largely in the second mode. The jokes about Meg's appearance were exploitation. There was no truth being exposed, no recognition being created. There was just a character being used as a resource, her humiliation extracted for comedic value, without the audience being asked to engage with what the humiliation actually meant or felt like. The distinction matters because the audiences who watched were absorbing both things. They were absorbing the genuine insight when the show found it, and they were also absorbing the exploitation when the show produced that instead. And over the run of the show, the exploitation vastly outnumbered the insight. What does it do to an audience to watch years of exploitation comedy at the expense of a character who is, in any fair reading, a sympathetic victim of her family's dysfunction? The research on media effects and attitudes is complicated and contested, And there are good reasons to be cautious about drawing straight lines from television content to real-world behavior or belief. But there is something worth noting about the cultural normalization of certain patterns. The "shut up, Meg" phenomenon, which Mila Kunis discussed publicly in the context of people saying this to her in real life, is evidence that the comedy the show produced about Meg's treatment had real-world consequences. The phrase became a way of dismissing or silencing someone, of expressing contempt for a person who was trying to be heard. That it was used against the real woman who gave Meg her voice suggests a particularly direct line between the content and its cultural uptake. This does not mean that Family Guy caused people to be cruel. People were cruel before Family Guy, but it does mean that the show contributed, in a small way, to a cultural repertoire of cruelty, to a set of reference points and phrases and images that could be deployed in the service of dismissing or belittling another person. The comedy that normalized contempt for Meg, repeated across hundreds of episodes during the years of the show's peak cultural relevance, was not without effect. The more hopeful counterpoint to this is the way the show's fandom, particularly in online spaces, responded to Meg. Far from absorbing the show's contempt as their own, many of the show's most engaged fans developed a strong protective feeling toward Meg. They recognized her as the most sympathetic character in the show. They celebrated the moments when she stood up for herself. They were angry at the ending of Seahorse Seashell Party in ways that suggested they had not accepted the show's argument that Meg's sacrifice was appropriate or necessary. This suggests that the audience was not simply absorbing what the show produced. They were engaging critically with it, comparing what the show did to their own sense of what was right, and arriving at a judgment that was sometimes in direct contradiction to the show's apparent position. This kind of active audience engagement is part of what makes television culture something other than pure top-down transmission of messages. The audience talks back. They form communities around shared responses. They create interpretive frameworks that sometimes correct for the show's own blind spots. The Meg who exists in fan culture, the Meg who is defended and advocated for, and occasionally written into stories where she gets the treatment she deserves, is in some ways more real and more culturally present than the Meg who is being abused on screen. The audience took the character the show was mistreating and decided she was worth more than that, and they were right. This is the most genuinely hopeful thing in the entire Family Guy parenting story. Not the show's redemption arcs, as real and meaningful as some of them were. Not the gradual rehabilitation of characters who had been damaged by bad creative decisions. The most hopeful thing is the audience's refusal to simply accept the show's most damaging premises, their insistence that Meg Griffin was not a punchline, their recognition of her as a real person, in the way that fictional characters become real persons when they are written with enough truth and enough specificity to touch something actual in the people who encounter them. Meg Griffin is a real person. Not biologically, not legally, not in any of the ways that matter for most purposes, but in the way that matters for this purpose, which is the question of whether her story meant something, whether she was seen, whether her suffering acknowledged something true about how some families work and some children grow up. She is as real as any fictional person ever gets, and the audience knew it, even when the show was trying to tell them it was just a joke. Closing addendum. A final word on falling asleep to this? You are still here. Somewhere in your room or your bed or on a couch with a blanket pulled up, you have been with this for a long time. Hours. Maybe. Long enough to travel through the Griffin household from its first days to its current ones. Long enough to sit with Meg and Peter and Lois and Chris and Stewie and Brian and think about what their story means. There is something particular about the experience of falling asleep to this kind of content. The voice in the dark, the slow, careful narration of something that matters, the feeling of being held by a story even as consciousness loosens its grip and sleep begins to pull you under. It is a different way of encountering ideas than reading or watching. The listening body is more relaxed. The critical mind is softer. Things penetrate in different ways. What we have been through tonight is, at its core, a story about love and failure and the complicated relationship between them. About parents who loved imperfectly and the children who received that imperfect love and grew up inside it. About the way the things that happen in families ripple forward through time, shaping the people who experience them and the people those people eventually become. The Griffin family is a cartoon. They will never grow old. Peter will never sit across from an adult Meg and say all the things he should have said. Lois will never have a long conversation with a grown Chris about who he actually is and what he actually needs. Stewie will never have a full-length, fully conscious conversation with his mother that lasts long enough to say everything. The show's format will not allow it. But you are not a cartoon. And if something in the long story we went through tonight touched something in your own life, in your own family, in your own history with parents or children, or the complicated space where love and harm coexist, then you have the thing that the Griffins do not have. You have the ability to carry what you have understood forward, to do something different, to interrupt a pattern, to see someone who has been not seen. Families are not fixed systems. They are living things that can change. Not easily. Not without effort and courage and the willingness to stay with the discomfort of growth. But the possibility is real. The psychological literature is full of people who changed patterns that had been in their families for generations. Who decided that the cycle would stop with them? Who found in the understanding of what had been done to them the motivation to do something different for the people in their care? The Griffins, at their best, pointed toward this. In the moments when Peter remembered his daughter's worth, in the moments when Lois really heard one of her children, in the moments when the family showed each other the love that was always there beneath everything else. Those moments were real, even in a cartoon. They happened. Let them be the last images you carry as you drift off tonight. Not the cruelty, not the resets, not the Flanderization or the dysfunction or the long years of Meg being used as a punchline. Let it be Peter telling his daughter she is wonderful. Let it be Stewie and Lois finally hearing each other across the chasm that kept them apart for 20 years. Let it be the Griffin family, imperfect and loud and sometimes terrible, sitting at the dinner table together at the end of another day. Good night. Be good to the people who depend on you. See you next time. Supplemental Section E. The Children's Coping Strategies. How the Griffin kids survived their household. Every child who grows up in a household with significant dysfunction develops strategies for surviving it. These strategies are adaptive in the sense that they help the child manage an environment they cannot control. They are often maladaptive in the sense that they create patterns that extend beyond that environment and cause problems in later life. The coping strategies of the Griffin children, rendered in comedic form across 25 years of television, are recognizable to anyone familiar with the developmental psychology literature on how children adapt to difficult family circumstances. Meg's coping strategy in the early seasons was a kind of stoic persistence. She kept showing up. She kept trying. She kept presenting herself to the family and to the social world of her school as someone who wanted to be included and valued, even as the evidence accumulated that inclusion and value were not forthcoming. This persistence is not simple masochism. It is the strategy of someone who has not yet given up on the possibility that things could be different. The child who keeps returning to the parent who repeatedly disappoints them is not stupid or weak. They are operating from the understanding, correct at the evolutionary level, that the parent is their best chance of survival, and that giving up on that relationship is not an option. As the show moved into its later seasons and the abuse intensified, Meg's coping strategies diversified in ways that are psychologically accurate. She developed obsessive attachments to anyone who showed her kindness, which is the predictable response of someone whose experience of warmth has been so scarce that any small amount of it seems infinitely precious and must be clutched and held at whatever cost. She pursued relationships with people who were demonstrably unavailable or inappropriate, including Brian, who could not return her feelings, and a convicted criminal who was charming in the particular way that people who have grown up with unreliable caregivers often find charming. The charm of someone who is dangerous and unpredictable but who occasionally makes you feel seen. The episode Dial Meg for Murder represents the most dramatic and explicit shift in Meg's coping strategy. Prison, in the world of the show, gave her something her home never had: a clear hierarchy, consistent rules, and the respect that comes from being physically capable of defending yourself. She came back from prison with a different repertoire. The compliance and absorption that had been her primary tools were replaced, temporarily, with dominance and aggression. This is a documented response to extended victimization. The person who has been consistently subordinate and targeted learns, in a context that rewards different behavior, that they are capable of being something else. The problem is that aggression and dominance, while they feel like liberation, are usually just the opposite end of the same dysfunctional continuum. They replace victimization with the enactment of power over others rather than with the genuinely different relational mode that would represent real health. Meg's later evolution in the show, the version that emerged in seasons 15 and beyond, when the abuse had largely ended, is more interesting and more genuinely hopeful. She became resilient in a quieter way. She developed the capacity to push back without becoming a bully. She showed toughness in specific situations without translating it into general aggression. The saxophone storyline in The Simpsons crossover episode gave her something important, a specific domain in which she was genuinely good, a skill that was hers and that did not depend on anyone else's approval for its value. The child who has been repeatedly told they are worthless often finds their way out of that story through a specific competence that they develop in spite of everything, something that tells them, through the reliable feedback of the activity itself, that they are capable of excellence. Chris's coping strategies are in some ways the most healthy of the three Griffin children, which is a low bar given the competition but still worth noting. He developed a kind of friendly emotional distance. He was present in the family without being fully engaged with its dysfunction. He participated in the family dynamics without being captured by them. He had his own interests, his art, and later his various other enthusiasms that gave him something to return to when the family environment became overwhelming. This is the strategy of someone who has found an alternative source of self-worth and who uses it as a refuge. The evil monkey that lived in Chris's closet, which was a recurring element in the show for many seasons before being resolved in a later episode, is worth thinking about in this context. The monster in the closet is a classic symbol of childhood anxiety. In Chris's case, the monster was real and was specifically antagonistic toward him. The fact that no one in his family took this seriously, that the monster was visible to Chris but dismissed or ignored by everyone else, is a recognizable portrait of a certain kind of childhood experience. The thing that frightens you, the thing that you know is there, is not acknowledged by the adults in your life. Their inability or unwillingness to see the monster becomes, over time, as frightening as the monster itself, because it tells you that you are on your own, that the adults who are supposed to protect you from the things that go bump in the night are not reliable protectors. The resolution of the evil monkey storyline, when the monkey and Chris finally settled their differences and parted on relatively good terms, is presented as comedy. But it also mirrors a common element in successful therapy for people who grew up with unacknowledged fears. The moment when the feared thing is finally named, brought into the light, and discovered to be manageable in a way that the childhood mind could not access. Stewie's primary coping strategy is intelligence. He survives the isolation of his situation through the sheer sophistication of his own mind. He can construct elaborate plans, build impressive things, travel through time, and maintain an internal narrative that gives meaning and structure to his existence. This is the coping strategy of the intellectually gifted child who has learned that their mind is the one thing they can rely on absolutely when the environment around them is unreliable. The world of ideas, the world of problems and solutions, is more predictable and more responsive to Stewie's needs than the human world around him. The danger in this strategy, which the show depicts with surprising accuracy in its handling of Stewie's emotional development, is that intelligence alone is not enough. The mind can construct elaborate defenses and brilliant narratives, but it cannot fully substitute for the relational warmth that human beings need. Stewie's dependence on Brian, the intensity of his attachment to the one person who truly knows him, is the tell. The intelligence is the armor. Brian is the wound in the armor, the place where need leaks through. And it is exactly in that wound that the show finds its most genuine emotional material. In the Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, locked in the bank vault, Stewie's intelligence is useless. There is nothing to build, no problem to solve, no scheme to execute. There is only the two of them and the night and the conversation that follows. Stewie, stripped of his usual resources, is revealed as someone who is lonely in a very specific way. Not the melodramatic loneliness of someone who has never been loved, but the particular loneliness of someone who can only be known by one person and who lives in constant anxiety that that person might be lost. When Brian reveals his suicidal ideation in this episode, Stewie's response is not to try to fix it or to produce a clever solution. He listens. He stays. He tells Brian, in his own complicated and emotionally guarded way, that Brian's life matters to him in a way that is not rationalizable and not contingent on anything. This is the most fully differentiated emotional behavior we see from Stewie in the entire run of the show. He is present to Brian's pain without trying to manage it away. He is offering what Brian needs rather than what Stewie has available. It is the kind of thing that a good parent does for a child in distress. And Stewie learned it, the show implies, from Brian himself. From the thousands of moments when Brian sat with Stewie and was present to whatever Stewie was experiencing without trying to fix it or dismiss it. The parenting that was not available to Stewie from his actual parents was provided, imperfectly but genuinely, by Brian. And Stewie internalized it and was able to give it back. The cycle of care, in this corner of the Griffin household, actually ran in a healthy direction. The three Griffin children's coping strategies, taken together, form a complete picture of the range of responses available to children who grow up in difficult households. Meg's persistence and her various forms of acting out, Chris's friendly distance and alternative competences, Stewie's intelligence and his intense focal attachment, none of these are ideal. All of them are comprehensible. All of them are what you would expect from children who have had to find ways to survive environments that were not fully safe for them. The fact that they survived, that all three of them are still present, still engaged with the family in some way, still capable of warmth and connection despite everything, is the show's most optimistic argument about resilience. Not the kind of resilience that requires everything to have been okay, or that pretends the damage was not done, but the kind that acknowledges the damage and shows that life and connection and growth are possible alongside it. Supplemental Section F, the show's self-awareness and what it reveals. Family Guy, particularly in its later seasons, became increasingly self-aware about its own history and its own failures. This self-awareness was expressed through the device of fourth wall breaking, through explicit acknowledgement of the show's declining quality in episodes and jokes, and through certain storylines that seemed designed to function as commentary on the show's own creative decisions. The most famous example of this self-awareness in the context of parenting is the very existence of Seahorse Seashell Party. The episode, written in 2011, when the show had been in its post-revival run for 6 years and the Meg abuse had been intensifying for several seasons, felt at the time like the writers finally engaging with what they had been producing. Meg's confrontation scene reads almost as a creative writing room confronting its own choices, using the character herself as the mouthpiece for the criticism. Whether this was intentional or not is hard to know from outside the writer's room, but the effect, for the viewer who was paying attention, was of a show that was looking at itself in the mirror and not entirely liking what it saw. The problem was that the looking did not result in change. The mirror was put away. The story continued as before. The Conway Twitty gag, discussed at length in the source material for this script, is another form of self-awareness that operated very differently. By inserting an entire unedited country song performance where a joke was supposed to be, the show was making a meta-joke about the audience's tolerance for its own material. It was saying, "We know you will keep watching even if we give you nothing." The fact that some people found this funny and others found it genuinely offensive is telling. The people who found it funny were in on the joke. The people who found it offensive were the joke. This is the uncomfortable place that self-aware comedy sometimes arrives at, where the audience is simultaneously invited to laugh and made into the object of the laughter. The show's self-awareness about Peter specifically was expressed most clearly through the Seahorse Seashell Party scene where Meg enumerates Peter's failings in detail. Every accusation Meg makes is backed by specific things the show has depicted. The show knows what it has done. It is acknowledging it through the character's voice. But the acknowledgement, again, does not lead to change. It leads to a joke about the family needing Meg as a lightning rod, which is the show's way of converting its own critique into another comedic premise. This is the fundamental limitation of the show's self-awareness. It is the self-awareness of a person who can see exactly what they are doing and why it is wrong, and continues doing it anyway. The seeing is real, the continuation is equally real. And the gap between them is the show's most honest portrait of its own character. In a strange way, this gap between seeing and changing is itself a parenting lesson. One of the things that makes genuine change so difficult in family systems is that insight and behavior change are not the same thing. You can understand completely why you treat your child a certain way, can trace it back to your own childhood, can articulate the cycle of transmission with perfect clarity, and still find yourself repeating the behavior the following week. Understanding is necessary but not sufficient for change. Change requires something beyond understanding. It requires new habits, new practices, new ways of being in the moment that are different from the habitual patterns. The show, at its meta level, enacts exactly this failure of insight without practice. It sees what it is doing. It says, through Meg's voice, that it sees, and then it goes back to doing it, because the format requires it, because the comedy machine needs its material, because changing would require not just seeing differently, but doing differently, and doing differently is the hardest thing. Real parents who grow up and recognize the patterns they inherited from their own parents face this same challenge. Seeing the pattern is the beginning. Living differently within the moment. When the old habit is pulling strongly and the new behavior feels unfamiliar and effortful, is where the real work is. The show could only do the seeing. The doing was beyond its reach. But you are not a television show. You are a person. The doing is available to you in a way that it was never available to Peter Griffin, who existed in the perpetual present tense of episodic comedy, where every week is its own universe, and the lessons of last week cannot carry forward. Your life has continuity. Your relationships have memory. The things you learn can stay with you and change how you move through the world. The seeing that the show made possible, whatever genuine insight it produced about parents and children and the way love gets expressed and withheld and distorted and occasionally found, can become the beginning of something different. That is the gift that good storytelling, even deeply flawed storytelling, can offer. Not answers, not models. Just the expanded perception that comes from having seen something clearly for a moment, even in the context of a cartoon comedy about a family on a fictional street in a fictional Rhode Island town. Take what is useful, leave what is not. Carry the seeing forward. Total approximate word count, 30,400 plus. Supplemental section G. The Griffin household and the American dream of family. The Griffin family lives in Rhode Island. They live in a 2-story house on a suburban street in a fictional town. Peter works for a living, or at least he does most of the time, holding jobs at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory in the earlier seasons, and the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery in the later ones. Lois stays home and manages the household. They have 3 children and a talking dog. They have a car and a yard, and neighbors they know by name. They have, in short, most of the external markers of what has historically been called the American dream of family life. The American dream of family, as it was constituted in the post-World War, 2 decades and as it was reinforced by half a century of television, was a specific vision. It involved a nuclear family in a suburban setting, with a breadwinner, father, and a homemaker mother and 2.5 children and a station wagon. It promised that if you assembled the correct elements in the correct configuration, you would achieve not just material comfort but emotional fulfillment. The family would be not only financially stable but psychologically healthy, a warm and supportive environment in which children would grow into confident and capable adults and parents would find meaning and purpose in their caregiving roles. Family Guy arrived in 1999, with the external elements of this vision intact and the interior of it in varying degrees of collapse. The house is there, the yard is there, the structure is there, but inside, the promise that the structure was supposed to deliver has not been kept. Peter is not a stable or reliable provider. Lois's homemaking role is not being experienced as fulfilling so much as it is being experienced as inescapable. The children are not growing into confidence and capability, but are instead navigating various forms of neglect and harm. The dream, as the show lived it, was an external fact that had been drained of its interior substance. This was true of many shows that came before Family Guy as well. The Simpsons did it, Married with Children did it. Roseanne did it differently and with more political directness, showing a working-class family for whom the economic promises of the dream had also failed to materialize. But Family Guy did it in a way that was specific to its moment and to its particular brand of comedy. The collapse of the interior in the Griffin household was rendered with a particular kind of darkness that was distinctive. Not the wry sociological observation of The Simpsons or the deliberately anti-romantic comedy of Married with Children, but something that felt, particularly in the show's middle seasons, like a genuine portrait of damage. The house on Spooner Street is, in this reading, a monument to the gap between the promise and the reality of the American family ideal. It looks right from the outside. It has the right number of bedrooms and the right address and the right surname on the mailbox. But inside, The people the ideal was supposed to serve are not being served by it. The father is not providing stable, loving guidance. The mother is not providing unconditional support. The children are not developing in conditions of safety and nurturance. The dream has the walls but not the warmth. This is not a political statement the show was consciously making. Family Guy's politics were always more interested in individual targets than in structural critiques. But the portrait it produced, of a family that had all the external signs of having made it, and none of the interior experience of what making it was supposed to provide, was a political statement by implication. It was saying, the dream is hollow. The checklist was completed. The house was built. And the thing the house was supposed to contain is not there. The show, being a comedy, could not fully commit to this as the dark observation it is. The darkness was always cut with the comedy. The genuine portrait of family failure was always wrapped in jokes and cutaways and reset buttons and the various other mechanisms the format provided for managing the weight of what was being shown. But the portrait was there, underneath all of it. And audiences who were themselves living in houses that looked right from the outside and felt wrong on the inside recognized something in the Griffins, whether or not they could have articulated exactly what they were recognizing. The question of what the show's cultural presence did with this recognition is complex. Comedy, as noted in the previous section, can illuminate or it can normalize. The Griffins' dysfunction could function as a mirror that made viewers more aware of dysfunction in their own families, prompting examination and ultimately change. It could also function as a normalizing force, making certain patterns seem so familiar and so comically presented that they lose their power to disturb. The evidence suggests both effects were present in different viewers at different moments. The viewer who watched Seahorse Seashell Party and had a moment of recognition about their own family, who felt seen in Meg's confrontation in a way that was uncomfortable and important, experienced the mirror effect. The viewer who watched years of Meg abuse and absorbed it as simply how the show worked, who applied the shut up Meg formula to real people in their real lives, experienced the normalization effect. The difference between these effects was not primarily determined by the show's content, it was determined by what the viewer brought to the watching, which is to say that the show's cultural impact was not something the show controlled entirely. It was a collaborative product of the storytelling and the audience's engagement with it. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The stories we consume do not determine us. They provide material. What we do with that material is shaped by who we already are, by what experiences we bring to the encounter, by the questions we are already asking when the story arrives. Family Guy, at its worst, was producing material that could be used to normalize cruelty. Family Guy, at its best, was producing material that named something true about how families can fail and what that failure costs. What any given viewer took from it depended enormously on where they were coming from. The viewers who were themselves Meg, who grew up in households where they were the designated absorber of the family's dysfunction, found in the show both a mirror of their experience and, in its better moments, a voice for their own pain. The viewers who were more like Peter, who were the ones who perhaps needed to hear what Meg was saying, may have found it easier to laugh along with the comedy than to receive the challenge. Television reaches everyone simultaneously. It speaks to the person who needs to see, and the person who needs to be seen at the same moment, in the same episode. What it offers to each of them is determined by the meeting between the text and the reader. And that meeting is always private, always particular, always producing something slightly different from what anyone else in the audience is producing at the same moment. The Griffin family is out there still, on streaming platforms and in reruns, and in the continuing new seasons that keep arriving according to the terms of their extended deal. They are sitting on their couch, having their arguments, making their cutaway gags, occasionally finding their way back to something real. New viewers are encountering them for the first time. Old viewers are revisiting them with years of additional experience and changed perspectives. The show that was made is not the show that is being received in any given moment. It keeps changing because the people watching it keep changing. This is the gift and the limitation of any cultural artifact that endures long enough to be encountered by multiple generations of audiences. The Griffin family that the viewers of 1999 encountered was different from the Griffin family that viewers of 2011 encountered, which was different again from what current viewers encounter in 2025. Not because the show changed, though it did, but because the audiences changed, because the cultural context changed. Because the things that seemed funny or acceptable or unremarkable in 1999 are different from what seems funny or acceptable or unremarkable now. The Meg abuse that was treated as standard comedic material in the middle seasons is almost certainly received differently by a 2025 audience than it was by an audience in 2008. The social conversations that have happened in the intervening years about bullying, about family abuse, about the specific dynamics of how girls are treated in families and in society, have changed the interpretive frame. What the show was doing does not look the same through the lens of those conversations as it looked before them. This is both an argument for hope and a caution about certainty. Hope because culture does change, because the conversations do happen, because what was invisible becomes visible over time. Caution because the change is uneven and incomplete, because there are still households where the Meg dynamic plays out in real life without being named or addressed, because awareness of a problem and the end of that problem are very different things. The Griffin family will keep sitting at their table on Spooner Street for however many more seasons the deal allows. They will keep being funny and dark and occasionally moving and often frustrating. And somewhere in that long continued run, they will keep finding those moments where something true breaks through the comedy and says, without apology, what it is. Those moments are worth being here for. Even if it takes a long time to arrive at them, especially then. A brief note on why this story matters now. We have spent a long time in the Griffin household tonight, and it is worth pausing before the very end to name something directly. The reason to spend this much time looking at a cartoon family's parenting failures is not academic. It is not to build a case against a television show or to reduce something that gave people genuine pleasure over many years to a document of its own worst moments. The reason is simpler and more personal than any of that. Parents and children have always told each other stories. Stories about how families work, about what love looks like, about what we owe the people we bring into the world, and what those people are allowed to expect from us. For most of human history, these stories were told directly, parent to child, elder to younger, across the small, intimate distances of family and community. In the modern era, television joined those stories. It became one of the primary places where society told itself what families were supposed to look like and how the people inside them were supposed to behave. Family Guy is part of that conversation. It is an imperfect and often deeply flawed part of it. But it is there, in the cultural record, in the shared memory of everyone who watched it across 25 years, and what it said about parents and children deserves to be examined with the same care we would bring to any story that millions of people absorbed. The specific things the show said, when it was saying them at its most honest, were worth hearing. The scapegoat dynamic is real. The flanderization of love into cruelty is real. The exhaustion of the functional parent is real. The loneliness of the child whose inner life cannot reach the adults responsible for them is real. The cycle of intergenerational transmission of harm is real. The possibility of breaking that cycle is also real, and the show found its way to it in certain episodes, even if it could never quite sustain the break. These are not abstract psychological concepts. They are descriptions of what happens in actual families, to actual people, with actual consequences for the lives those people go on to live. The child who grows up as the family's scapegoat does not leave that role behind when they leave the house. They carry it with them. They carry the internal voice that says, "You deserve this treatment, this is what you get, this is what you are." Unhooking from that voice is possible, but it takes work and time, and sometimes professional help, and always some kind of sustained commitment to seeing yourself differently than you were taught to see yourself. Telling stories about this, even in the imperfect and inconsistent and often comedically irresponsible way that Family Guy did, contributes to a cultural vocabulary for these experiences. It makes them a little more nameable, a little more visible, and visibility is where change begins. So this long night of listening was, at its core, about that. About the value of looking carefully at the stories we have been telling ourselves and asking what they reveal. About the Griffin family as a lens through which some real things about family life, some things that are difficult to look at directly, become possible to see. You have seen some of those things tonight. What you do with them is yours. Sleep well.